The garage was empty, so it can't be there.
Figure out, I put it on your table, and I think I left it on the script thing, and you have to figure out how it's happening. You're very what's his name, forward in my message, Jay asked, I think the she said, oh.
Yes, it was on South Carolina. Yeah, I mean, the Military History Institute is the Army's archives. Yeah. I'm going up there, I'm going up there in April. Yeah.
Can you go up there?
Sure. But you just have to check the website for their office out, for their hours, and all that. They changed buildings, so they moved everything from one building to another, so we're still kind of getting it all.
I guess there might be one
Yeah,
box
just
or
if you want to
something
research,
high.
you know it's out
There
there.
might be
You
one
just
box
have
or
to check
something
the.
at the house.
So it's kind of like going to the South Carolina archives. You know, they
Come in, I'm Carol Summers.
Yeah.
All my life, not so little done.
Yeah, but,
For the Miss America sign coming through Manning, I don't see it up there.
oh, well. You guys want to move on up and take a seat? You have to be here
A couple pieces of business. This is and so forth, is Stacy McGinnis. Local folks all know him as one of the vice presidents of Clarendon Bank. Anybody coming in that wants to do banking, go to Bank of Clarendon. How's that for an advertisement?
That's great, George, I appreciate it.
Okay, Stacy McGinnis.
No, I think everybody who works at the bank's a vice president. I believe that's the way it works. I do want to welcome you to Clarendon County. How many of you do not live in Clarendon County? Let's see some hands. Wonderful, wonderful. How many of you who do not live in Clarendon County but have ties to Clarendon County? Raise your hand. So a few people coming back home a little bit. Well, good. We're glad to have you with us this weekend. And we hope this will be an enjoyable as well as an educational weekend for you. We're going to do a lot of neat things, particularly tomorrow. We've got a lot of good speakers lined up today and tomorrow, and we hope you really have a good time and really enjoy Clarendon County. Everyone should have a packet that George and Carol put together. And on the right-hand side of that, you'll see a list of our speakers and a little bit about them. I'm not going to insult your ignorance by reading this to you. You can read it yourself, but I do just want to, when I introduce people, at least just let you know who's coming up. Our first speaker today is Frank Stovall. Frank is manager of Musgrove Mill State Historic Site, and he's going to present today about Musgrove Mill. So Frank, appreciate you being with us today, and hope you can have a good presentation for us.
Well, it's good to be here. I've never been filmed before, so I feel a little camera shy. And for those of you who know me, I really am Frank Stovall. Everyone who knows me well has said, I don't recognize you without your Park Service uniform on. So I'm undercover and incognito today as a park ranger in front of you. Thanks for having me. I'm probably not going to take up the whole hour, but I want to talk to you a little bit about Musgrove Mill, the battle that occurred on Edward Musgrove's plantation in 1780, and some of the things that the Park Service is doing to protect and preserve that battlefield. I'm here to speak to you today about something that is very important to me and to many other people who reside in the state of South Carolina. It's our history and our heritage, and I don't think you'd be here today if that wasn't important to you. I want to tell you a story, one of heroism, of patriots, of Tories, and redcoats, one of events that occurred in our state's own backyard. And I want to tell you how the Park Service, the agency I work for, is committed to protecting the hallowed ground on which this tale took place, and on educating the public about the importance of the action that a small band of patriots took during a typically hot summer day in August of 1780. And I've discovered, as I get older, I know I don't look that old, that I end up playing the trombone a little more when I read. So if you folks don't mind, I'm going to get closer to my notes. There. I need you to do me a favor. I need you to step back in time with me to 1780, to a time before motor cars, to a time before air conditioning, to a time before Days Inn, and modern conveniences. Come with me for a minute back to the American Revolution. Now, I often find it very hard to believe that at one point in our nation's history, the area to the east of present-day Greenville, in fact, even this area here in Clarendon County, was the frontier. This is the border in 1780 between the known and the unknown, between the civilized world and what many believe to be the uncivilized world, the backcountry. It was in this frontier world, in present-day Lawrence County, that a gentleman named Edward Musgrove, a respected landowner, tax collector, and mill owner, lived. His grist mill on the banks of the Enoree River would witness a battle that would occur between Patriot forces and Tory supporters in August of 1780. And why were the British in his neck of the woods? Why were they in his neighborhood? Well, as we all know, British troops had intended to break the Patriot back by splitting New England in two, and then destroying Patriot forces under the command of General George Washington. However, their plan didn't work. After the stunning American victory at Saratoga in 1777, the war in the northern colonies would become stalemate, and British forces made the decision to take the war to the south. One, because they felt that a majority of Southerners were loyal to the crown, and secondly, because they wanted to save the very economically important and valuable to them southern colonies. At the time, South Carolina was the richest of the colonies and producing more income for England. In 1778, the British would capture Savannah with ease. In May of 1780, the British would capture Charleston and 5,000 American troops. And incidentally, that fall of Charlestown in 1780, that loss of 5,000 American troops, that would be the single largest surrender of American forces in history until 1943 and the Battle of Corregidor in the South Pacific Theater of World War II. All the British had to do at that point was move north, join forces with the British Army operating in the northern colonies, and cut the Americans off from one another. And lucky for us, that never happened. Instead, what the British would face for the next 3 years would be continued hardship and continued difficulties here in the Carolina backcountry at the hands of American patriots through small fights and big battles, until they themselves would be forced to give up all control of the colonies. The war began coming apart for the British here, in the interior of South Carolina. In 1780, this area was the frontier of America. It was the wild, wild west, a rugged, hard, lonely, and unforgiving wilderness. It would see some of the bloodiest fighting of the American Revolution. Before the British Army could begin their march north, they had to solve a problem that all armies had faced throughout time. How do we move troops and also move with them food, medicine, clothing, supplies, and all the logistical needs that an army faces to move forward in the field? The farther north or the farther west that British troops moved, the further away they would get from their main supplies in Charlestown. To solve this problem, they built a string of forts across South Carolina at places that you heard of. Places like Rocky Mount, Hanging Rock, Camden, Cheraw, and 96. And from these outposts, Tories would fan out, like the spokes on a child's bicycle did, to guard other strategically important places, strategically important roads, strategically important bridges, ferries, mills. In fact, such as the Forge Mill that existed on Edward Musgrove's property. In 1780, Edward Musgrove was the owner of a pretty good-sized tract of land on the south side of the Enoree River. He was educated, he was influential, and he tried very hard to remain neutral during the conflict. Unfortunately for him, the British had other ideas. First, the grist mill on his property could be used to supply troops with meal and flour for food. And second, he had a known river crossing. Now in 1780, this is very important because there were very few good roads in the backcountry of South Carolina, and even fewer decent places to cross rivers. Knowing where you could and could not cross a river safely and controlling that area would be of vital importance. And it was decided, British authorities, that there should be a garrison or force there at Musgrove's Mill. And on August 18th of 1780, the hills around the Musgrove home were alive with the sights and sounds of the 200 loyalists that were camped around it. I want to take a break here and talk about Edward Musgrove and divided loyalties. How many of you have heard of the Battle of Musgrove's Mill before I came here today? A few of you. How many of you have heard of Edward Musgrove? A few of you. A lot of history books we read, a lot of accounts we read about talk about Edward Musgrove being a Tory. Whether he was a Tory or a patriot, I'll tell you, I'm still not convinced either way. But I want to talk about it for a minute. Because Edward Musgrove had seen battle before. He had been involved in frontier wars with Native American tribes. He had actually commanded a fort near present-day Whitmire. It's actually very close to a recreation area called Molly's Rock, which is managed by the United States Forest Service. And he had seen firsthand the brutality of war in the Carolina backcountry during the colonial period. And by 1780, the American Revolution had been going on for 5 years. So it's not difficult to surmise that Mr. Musgrove was probably tired of war, a face-to-face war and a combat that was going on. The second issue that Edward Musgrove was facing when he began to debate whether or not to choose sides was what he had. He had journeyed to South Carolina with a land grant from the king and had set up a plantation on the Enoree River. His brother had set up a farm on the Tiger River not too far away. By 1780, he had a bustling farm, an operating grist mill. He was a tax collector. He was respected, educated, slaveholder, operating a very profitable little enterprise for himself there on the Enoree River. To pick the wrong side could mean losing everything he had. And what we do know about Edward Musgrove was he was the type of guy who was more concerned about himself than the greater good. He was even contacted by Drayton during the prior to the war and asked to join the Patriot side. And in a letter, Musgrove responds to that by addressing the fact that if he was to choose the wrong side and fail in the endeavor, he would basically lose everything he owned. If he went off to fight with the Patriots, his neighboring Tories might burn his house and home down. And if he sided with the Tories, the Patriots may do the same to him. So he tried to maintain his neutrality throughout the war. Now, everybody has a morning routine. I get up in the morning, I fix a cup of coffee, I step out on my front porch, and I greet the day. And I don't know if that was Edward Musgrove's morning routine, but in August of 1780, regardless of what his morning routine was, he stepped outside and greeted the day. And although my day, living on a state park, comes with songbirds and nice sunrise and all the wonderful things that come with living in the country, Edward Musgrove's day came with 200 armed neighbors, Tories, who showed up and said something along the lines of, "Reclaim your home and land in the name of the king. What do you think of that?" He said, "Here's the keys." And I would too. Because if you all show up on my property in the morning armed to the teeth and say, "Reclaim your land and property in the name of Francis Marion Symposium," I'll be happy to give you the keys, coffee. You can even use my car. Okay? Just don't hurt. So that was the situation in August of 1780. Edward Musgrove's home becomes a British field hospital and a command post for troops moving through the area. 200 Tories are there guarding the road crossing and the grist mill, and he and his family are still living on the property. Meanwhile, in August of 1780, some remnants of the Southern Army are camped near the North Carolina border. Most of these remnant men are militia, untrained volunteers, but not unskilled volunteers by this time. Several of the men were from the Lawrence County, South Carolina area, and they had learned of the Loyalist or Tory presence at Musgrove Mill. Now, sensing an opportunity, about 200 Patriots broke camp on the evening of August 18, 1780, and headed south for Musgrove's Mill. They were a very diverse group of men. They came from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The South Carolinians were led by, I don't know if you guys can see the wind out here, but it is just blowing things away.
There were
Whistling
treelings
around.
flying down on I-95 maybe 15 minutes ago.
Whistling around and looking for a good sturdy table to go under if it gets real bad. The South Carolinians were led by Colonel James Williams. Now, James Williams was from Lawrence County. He had a big plantation in Lawrence County. His family lived in Lawrence County. He would lose several sons to the war. He had a very vested interest in bringing a contingent of Patriot troops home to Lawrence County because he knew that his family may have been feeling some of that Tory aggression on their homes and population. The Tennesseans, of course, were led by Colonel Isaac Shelby. I don't know how much you know about Shelby, but Shelby would become the first governor of the future Commonwealth of Kentucky, and that kind of tells you that he survived the Battle of Musgrave Mill. The Georgians were led by Elijah Clark. If you've ever studied Georgia history, you know about Elijah Clark. Traveling at night to avoid being detected and to avoid the heat of Carolina summer, they arrived at an old Indian field that overlooked the Enoree River to the north of Edward Musgrove's plantation. They arrived very early in the morning of August 19, 1780. Now, I don't know how you guys feel after a long trip. I just got off a 9-hour plane ride yesterday. I was exhausted. I didn't want to see another flight attendant or another piece of airline food for a long time. I didn't want to see an airport or customs. I wanted to get in my car, come home, get in a soft bed, eat a warm meal, and just relax. These guys spent about 8 or 9 hours on horseback over rough backcountry roads at night. They did not get a warm meal. They did not get a warm bed. That customs didn't hassle them either, but, which was a plus. But they were exhausted, and now they had to face a possible battle against what they thought were 200 Tory troops. So the point by telling you the story is everyone in here has been on a long trip. Everyone in here knows how it feels to crawl out. I'm 6'2", I kind of spring out of the car when it stops. But everyone knows how it feels to crawl out of a car in an airplane seat after a long trip. You know the exhaustion that you feel. Imagine what these troops were feeling in 1780. Now, the very first thing they did was to get a clear picture of the situation. Williams, Clark, and Shelby, who were sharing command of this detachment, sent a small unit out to assess their situation, to get some intelligence on the position and strength of loyalists. But before this could really be accomplished, those men in that small little unit that went out to gather intelligence encountered a loyalist patrol sent out to do the same thing. And a very brief skirmish broke out in which one of the loyalists was wounded. The Patriots had now lost the element of surprise. Now, at the same time, the Patriot commanders were receiving a little bit more bad news. You see, they peered over the ridge down to that valley, and they saw all the things that we talked about earlier: Edward Musgrove's home, the 200 Tories, the mill. They saw other cook fires too, and they were also informed by a local gentleman that an additional 300 British troops had moved up in the night to Musgrove's mill. These weren't Tories. These were British provincials. To make matters worse, they were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Ennis. It was real troops. And this now brings the Tory British number to 500. 500 British Tory troops versus 200 Patriot troops. The Patriots could not retreat because of the rigors of a 40-mile ride the previous night, but fighting or attacking such a superior force head-on would be suicide. What they needed was a plan. The Patriots decided to form a line that straddled the main road behind the timbered ridge overlooking the Indian field, and they would wait there for the British to attack. To bring the British up the road fell onto a young Georgian officer. His name was Shadrach Inman, and he and a small hand-picked group of men, 10 to 12 to 15, depending on the accounts you read, mounted their horses, rode down the hill into the British camps. You could almost imagine them kicking over cook pots and firing their guns into the air, and then they turned and retreated back up the hill towards the Patriot position. The British did what British troops do in 1780. They jumped up, formed 3 nice straight lines, crossed the river, and up the road they went to take care of this small little Patriot force. When the British got to within 70 yards of the Patriots, the Patriot forces opened fire. An initial volley, it really didn't do anything to the British, but stunned them. They were quickly able to regroup and attack, and at this point it became a very pitched battle with both sides, British and Patriot, under very heavy fire. The turning point of the battle, and every battle has a turning point, came when the British were able to press within a few yards on the right side of the Patriot line. Seeing this, Colonel Elijah Clark sprung into action, shifted 40 men over to this side to reinforce the line, and at nearly the very same time, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Ennis, the commander of British troops in the field, was shot. With that, with the loss of their leadership, with nearly every British officer wounded by this time, the British began to fall back. The Patriots, who had now done the impossible, moved a superior force off the field, chased them. Some accounts discussing chasing them all the way to Fort 96. Now, everyone in here has been to reenactments, or everyone in here has heard the unique report or sound that a weapon from this time period makes. And if you've been to a large reenactment, you've smelled that very unique smell of black powder weapons in use. While this entire battle is going on, while the British troops are going downhill back towards the Erie River, with the Patriot forces right behind them, there is one lone Patriot post rider on the road who now hears this sound and who smells those smells and knows that he's too late. His job was to catch the Patriot force. In the middle of the battle, the rider shows up and catches Williams and Clark and Shelby and informs them that the Southern Army at Camden, under command of Horatio Gates, was defeated 3 days earlier. What this means for these 3 Patriot commanders is, number one, they're now one of the few effective fighting forces in South Carolina left. Number two, if they get in serious trouble, no one's coming to help them. And they're 52 miles behind enemy lines. That's an 8-hour ride on horseback. The 3 Patriot commanders made a very wise decision to withdraw. Now, although they were unable to take the field, the battle is still a Patriot victory. Of the 500 British soldiers involved, I'm going to make sure I get these numbers right, more than 60 were killed and 70 were taken prisoner. That's 26% casualty rate. Of the 200 Patriots, only 4 were killed. It's a 2% casualty rate. One of those killed, however, unfortunately was Captain Shadrach Inman, and he was buried on the field of battle. Even though this is a relatively small battle, I want to talk about why it's important and why we shouldn't underestimate the importance of small battles like Musgrove Mill. First of all, this is one of only a handful of incidents in the American Revolution where American militia forces are going to clearly defeat seasoned and trained British provincial troops. Secondly, the story at Musgrove Mill shows in very clear detail the style of fighting that militia troops in South Carolina were adopting after the fall of Charleston. This victory came after a very horrendous defeat of American forces at Camden and also at Fishing Creek. It gave American forces a needed boost in morale and the knowledge that backcountry forces could defeat the British, and these guys would use this knowledge and this boost in morale at a battle that I'm sure everyone in the room has heard of, Kings Mountain. But what I find very interesting about Musgrove Mill is it clearly demonstrates that the American Revolution is not just a revolt. The American Revolution is really a civil war with neighbor against neighbor. I'm going to throw out a statistic here, and every time I throw out this statistic, somebody tells me a different statistic. So if you want to use your different statistic, feel free. It really depends on which historian you read as to how you come up with these numbers, and these are just the numbers I use, so don't kill the messenger. I want you to look around and pick 5 people in this room that you know. Now, out of those 5 people, try to pick the 2 that are patriots. Because in 1780, about every 2 out of 5 folks was siding on the Patriot side. Have you picked them out? Pick out the one person out of the 5 folks you know that is only going to side with who's winning at the time. Okay? Who's going back and forth? All right? Pick out the other 2 who are Tories. Can you tell? You couldn't in 1780 either. Because everyone's dressed differently. No one is in uniform in this room. You don't know who your patriot friends are, who your Tory supporters are, or who the neutral person is. Musgrove Mill is a battle where you could very well be fighting the same people at your table, or the person sitting next to you. Brother against brother, colonist against colonist. The park that we've developed at Musgrove Mill that the state has opened up strives to serve really as a gateway to the American Revolution in South Carolina. Our visitor center, which is still in the process of development, however, it is open to the public. I have good news. We just brought in some more contractors to finish another set of exhibits, so I'm elated about that. We can talk about that later if you like. The purpose of our visitor center exhibits is to really provide an introduction into South Carolina's role in the American Revolution. We're doing it because we believe in 2 things. First, historic events have to be presented in context. It makes more sense if you know what happened before and what happened after. And secondly, we are working within a project called the Cradle of Democracy, that some of you may have heard of. The Cradle of Democracy, we call it COD, and it doesn't mean cash on delivery, is a partnership among several organizations. It includes the South Carolina State Park Service, the agency I work for, the National Park Service. Scott Withrow is here. He works with the folks at Calpins. And Palmetto Conservation Foundation and a lot of other agencies and organizations in state government and private groups. And its purpose is simply to protect, preserve, and educate the public about the numerous Revolutionary War sites that exist in the state. How many sites are there? Well, this depends on the study you read. But I'll tell you this, let's look at it this way. Every county in the state saw some sort of Revolutionary War action except for maybe Richland County. Now, Richland County being the seat of state government, I'm not entirely sure it's what we're fighting for, but Musgrove Mill State Historic Site Services is the hub for that endeavor. We work with interested organizations statewide to try to support battlefield preservation in those counties. I believe the National Park Service's number for battles in the American Revolution in South Carolina, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is like 183 or 187. Some go all the way up to 250 plus battles in South Carolina. What I tried to do for you today is to tell you the story of the Battle of Musgrove Mill and to try to impress upon you a little bit of the importance of saving some of these battlefields for generations to come. And I would be very remiss in my duties as a historian, as a preservationist, as a park manager, if I did not implore you, beg you, get down on my knees and plead with you to participate strongly in battlefield preservation initiatives across the state. I would like for the 2/5 of you who are patriots to go home after this conference and dig out your uniform and your tricorn hat and show up for the war. I would implore those of you who are neutral, and you know who you are, to pick the winning side. And I would beg those of you who are Tories to wake up, because there is a war still going on in South Carolina, whether you realize it or not. And that war is to protect the sites, the battlefields, where the history that will be talked about today and tomorrow occurred. There are no hard figures on how quickly we lose American Revolutionary War battlefields in the United States. But the folks at Civil War Preservation Trust feel that they lose an acre of Civil War battlefield every 10 minutes. That's 365 days a year. I'm pretty sure that figure would apply very well to American Revolutionary War sites on the East Coast as well. Means in the time it took me to talk to you today, somewhere 3 acres of battlefield became something else. It became a parking lot, shopping mall, school, government building, something. I urge you to become involved in the protection of battlefields in your areas of the state, in your hometown. I urge you to use the state and federal resources available to you to protect those battlefields. I urge you to support preservation initiatives and legislation, and to let your elected leaders know how you feel about historic preservation, why you feel it's important, and how important it is to you. And I think together we can, to paraphrase from my colleagues at the National Park Service, we can make South Carolina a place where freedom's flame is ignited in the feet of all who tread on our state's hallowed ground. Thank you for having me today. I'll be happy to entertain any questions you have.
Are there any questions for Frank? Going down front.
Or the 1780s roadbed, which is very pronounced throughout most of the site, that we are going to go back and do some landscape treatments too to try to restore it to the 1780s roadbed appearance. And the southernmost bank of the Enoree River, near the site where Edward Musgrove's first mill stood, is supported and shored up by a hand-stacked rock wall that has survived very well since the 1700s to today. But the rest of the structures are not.
To us from Cowpens National Battlefield. I think, Scott, this is your third year with us, isn't it? You've been with us all 3 years, so we're glad to have you back. Thanks for coming. Okay. Thank you.
I do work at Cowpens Battlefield, not Kings Mountain, but I'm not representing the National Park over at Kings Mountain, but I'm going to talk about Kings Mountain today. I grew up in western North Carolina, about 15 miles from Cowpens and about 30 miles from Kings Mountain. And I don't know if I wasn't listening, but I don't remember my high school teacher talking about either of them a lot. I had a textbook, and it was probably printed somewhere they didn't talk about the Southern Campaign a lot. So I don't remember talking a lot about those battles in high school. I did go to the battlefields. Cowpens was just a wide place in the road, and they didn't even have all the acreage they have now. They had only about an acre at the time. Kings Mountain had the old visitor center, which is still there. It's a stone structure, and very small, and they use it as offices today. So I do remember going when I was younger. My father always said, well, you had people in those battles, or the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I didn't know who those people were until I come to find out it was my fourth great grandfather. Reasons, and hard to tell who was loyalist and who was patriot. Of course, I always say that this was a Scotch-Irish war. The Withrows were Scotch-Irish. They were known, of course, for their cabins that they had appropriated from the German and Scandinavians. It became a Scotch-Irish thing to build log cabins. This is a picture of a young Scotch-Irish, mostly Scotch-Irish woman in the early 20th century. Scotch-Irish were, one of the British members of Parliament said that Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson. And that was very true, because the Scotch-Irish and the Presbyterian church were so, that church was so important in the lives of the Scotch-Irish. And you hear that some authors will say, well, the Scotch-Irish were just rednecks. Rednecks won the Battle of Kings Mountain. Well, the Presbyterian Church was a very moderating influence on the Scotch-Irish too. And some were very much frontier people. But some were, believed a lot in education also. Education was very important among the Scotch-Irish. I always like the story of the Scotch-Irish, which is probably a little bit prejudicial toward the Scotch-Irish. But the Germans who came, with the first thing they would build would be a barn, and the English would build a house. And of course, you know what the Scotch-Irish would build still. So this was a Scotch-Irish war. We can't leave out the German families either, and others, the French Huguenots, Francis Marion, especially in the back country, it was a Scotch-Irish war. I'm from Rutherford County, and it was part of Old Tryon County until just before the Battle of Kings Mountain, until it was divided in 1779 into Lincoln and Rutherford counties, and this is down where parts of Lincoln County, North Carolina. Rutherford County is about halfway between Charlotte and Asheville, if that would give you a little better identity as to where it is. It was on the frontier then. We don't know where that fourth great-grandmother of mine is buried. We think she was buried at the Britain Presbyterian Church. We can't find the tombstone. I think it's been destroyed.
Here for North Carolina, yes.
So
They wanted to be in South Carolina, so they're going to go around the Catawbas, and then they discovered they were off 10 miles.
Yeah, yeah.
So North Carolina gave York County, Cherokee, to South Carolina to make up for the error. And that area is called the New Acquisition.
The new acquisition, yes. Those new acquisition reenactors come to Cowpens.
Yeah, well, I'm president of that group.
Oh, okay, good, good. Well, you have to mention them. Well, here is Sergeant James Gray. There's an old Methodist church called Gray's Chapel, and it's there near where James Gray settled after the battle. It's near where the Over Mountain men crossed the Green River, which flows into the Broad, coming out of Polk County, North Carolina. You can't tell it by this picture, but the county line between Polk and Rutherford County, North Carolina, goes right down the middle of this church. In the middle of the church. The people from Polk County sit on one side, and the congregation from Rutherford County sits on the other. But it's in that area where the Over Mountain men every year, in their reenactment of the march, stop at this church in this area. Now, the Over Mountain men, I had some handouts here, and I only have 24, and I know some of you are challenging the Over Mountain men, and I'm glad Frank went before me, because Musgrove's Mill is so important as far as the Battle of Kings Mountain. That's when the Over Mountain men were escaping from, that far into enemy territory, as he said. And that's when they began to organize. And they went back to over the mountains to Tennessee, Sycamore Shoals. There were men eventually came down from Abington, Virginia, and others, and this is when they organized. In some ways, Musgrove's Mill is very much like Hammond's Store, that battle before the Battle of Kings Mountain. How many of you heard of Hammond's Store? That's a lost site in near Clinton, South Carolina, that William Washington really, it was akin to what Tarleton did at the Waxhaws. He really cut up some loyalists pretty good at Hammond's Store. And of course they knew that Morgan was in the area and came after. Tarleton came after. Kings Mountain is similar in that sense, in that Ferguson came after these over mountain men that were retreating and reorganizing. And he issued a decree somewhere warning that if they did not desist from their opposition to the British arms, and this is a famous statement, by the way, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. There's an author, Wilma Dykeman, who wrote a little booklet on the Battle of Kings Mountain, saying, titled "With Fire and Sword." But this was not the thing to say to these over mountain men. Got to their pride, and it also threatened their homes and their families. So they organized to come after it. And a lot of the first conflict took place in Rutherford County, North Carolina, where I'm from. This is Cane Creek, and this is where my family was. Cane Creek Valley. This is where my family was living at the time. Cane Creek, you can't see down there, but there's stories about Marlin's Knob here. My father, a long time ago, and I on a hike up there. You can look down on the valley from that knob. Revolutionary War soldiers, I think 7 or 8 really, buried in that cemetery, including my great-grandfather, and also 4th great-grandfather. Also, there's Thomas McCullough, who died of his wounds on the way back from Kings Mountain. And this is what it says on his tombstone. Here lies the body of Lieutenant Thomas McCullough, belonging to Colonel Campbell's Regiment, Virginia, who lost his life in and for the honorable, just, and virtuous cause of liberty at the defeating of Colonel Ferguson's infamous company of bandits at Kings Mountain. They spared no words there in describing Ferguson. In this battle, you find a lot of propaganda, a lot of harsh words on both sides, and it was very Civil War. And I'm going to give you a copy of this letter. But Ferguson also wrote a letter he sent out to all the loyalists in South Carolina, that area, and North Carolina. This is what he said. Unless you wish to be cut up by an inundation of barbarians, see, he called the over mountain men barbarians, who have begun by murdering an unarmed son before the aged father, and afterwards lopped off his arms, I don't know when that occurred, and who by their shocking cruelties and irregularities give the best proof of their cowardice and want of discipline. I say, if you wish to be pinioned, robbed, and murdered, and see your wives and daughters in 4 days abused by the dregs of mankind, in short, if you wish or deserve to live and bear the name of men, grasp your arms in a moment and run to camp. The backwater men have crossed the mountain. See, he refers to them as backwater men, not the over mountain men. They've crossed the mountains. McDowell, Hampton, Shelby, and Cleveland are at their head, so that you will know what you have to depend upon. If you choose to be degraded forever and ever by a set of mongrels, say so at once, and let your women turn their backs upon you, and look out for real men to protect them. Signed, Pat Ferguson, Major 71st Regiment. So this was the atmosphere as Ferguson came into Rutherford County, and the historian of Rutherford County, Clarence Griffin, says that Ferguson invaded Rutherford County. He set up camp at Gilberttown, which was the early courthouse in Rutherford County. This is a scene at Cane Creek, and my family's log cabin was somewhere where that larger house is right there today. Beautiful area. The over mountain men came in on where this rails to trail is now, an old railroad line that runs through part of Rutherford County. The road came pretty much there. They camped on a ridge. They commandeered the William Gilbert house. It's a little bit like Frank said. Who were the Musgroves? Were they Tories or were they Whigs? Well, who were the Gilberts? We don't think they were loyalists. William Gilbert was off in the colonial legislature at the time. And they took over his house. His wife was there, and some of his children. So they took the house, and the word spread that, well, William Gilbert was a loyalist because of this. But he wasn't, and he was exonerated of those charges later. But Ferguson camped on this ridge here in September 1780, and the mountain men came and camped at the same site. Here's the house of William Gilbert. Now, some people, it's not actually the original house. Some people say part of the house is the original house. You see the ridge behind it here. This is Ferguson's ridge, and Ferguson's army would have camped here, and Ferguson, this was his headquarters here in the house at the time. Here's another picture. Doesn't seem like such a high ridge, but you walk up it, it seems a little higher going up there. This was Gilbert Town, where the house was, named after William Gilbert. And this was the county seat for western North Carolina, for Rosa County, which extended into what is today Greene County and about 4 different counties in Tennessee. So you can see why some of the people in the Over Mountain area wanted to organize into the state of Franklin and later became Tennessee. That was a long way to come to the county seat. That was the county seat for a large area in western North Carolina going into what is today Tennessee. But very important in this battle leading to Kings Mountain, there was a Major Dunlap there. His is a story in itself. Let me move that over just a little bit. Major James Dunlap was wounded there at Cane Creek in a skirmish with the Patriot forces under Ferguson. And they retreated further at the time, and he was recuperated in a house there that they had again commandeered. And later, poor old James Dunlap was down in 96 and was captured. Well, guess where he was brought to again? He was brought back to Gilbert Town, and evidently when he was there before, he was so outspoken in his defense of the king that somebody murdered him again when he was there shot him while he was in bed there at the William Gilbert house. And so he's buried on the hill there. Queens Rangers of New Jersey, shot March 28, 1781. By the way, the Over Mountain men, it took them about 2 weeks to march from Tennessee over the mountains to Kings Mountain, and they camped at Gilbert Town 2 or 3 days before Ferguson. It was snowing in September as they crossed Yellow Mountain near Roan Mountain from Tennessee into North Carolina. There's about a number of inches of snow on the ground at that time. When the Over Mountain men and Ferguson left Gilbert Town, tracking him to Kings Mountain, they had to cross a number of little creeks. This is Mountain Creek where this dog was crossing. I was up on the bridge. He happened to be crossing at the time. Coming down, following the route, and I have walked with them some each year, and I really enjoy doing that. You're looking back now at Tryon Mountain in Polk County, North Carolina, near I-26. But this is the area in Polk County where the Over Mountain men came pursuing Ferguson. Ferguson took a little more of a northerly route. And, you know, they were thrown off. William Hill said they were thrown off by James Williams. I've also heard that Ferguson sent wagons further south also to throw them off. But they took a more southerly route in pursuit of Ferguson and camped at Cowpens the day before the Battle of Kings Mountain. So the Cowpens becomes a staging point for the Battle of Kings Mountain. So although my fourth great-grandfather didn't fight at Cowpens, he would have been there the night before the Battle of Kings Mountain. There are all sorts of kidnap stories and spy stories, and I've heard bunches of them, and I don't know which ones are true and which ones not. There's probably a nugget of truth in a lot of them, but here as they passed the, there was a log cabin then. This was a later Miller house. Ferguson took as hostage young Andrew Miller, who was just a teenager at the time. Crossed the Green River, the Over Mountain men did, near this point. And here is some scenes from some of the walks that they do each year. I went on one with my wife one year, and I told her it's going to be about 3 miles, don't worry. It turned out about 7. That's the last one she's done. But it's hard walking when cars are coming and you're stepping off the pavement and back on again. So, but some of the areas that are dirt roads now have been paved over in that area. And there are some really walking trails too on that. If you walk through the old Green River Road at Cowpens National Battlefield, you're walking down part of the original road. Up in the mountains near Limble Gorge, that area, there's a trail that may approximate the original walking. So there's some walking trails too. I don't know a lot of people who do the whole 2 weeks now. Maybe some. I've just walked part of it. Coming from Dowell County into Rutherford County. Now, I have found over the years that when people talk about Kings Mountain, I used to pass by a huge mountain when I was young on Highway 74, which is now, well, of course now we have I-85. And you see that mountain over there, and it's Crowder's Mountain. It's part of the Kings Mountain range. There is a range of mountains there. Crowder's Mountain is the northernmost part. It gets really smaller as it goes south. Kings Mountain is one of the smaller mountains. But I could imagine seeing Continental soldiers and redcoats all over Crowder's Mountain when I was young. This is Crowder's Mountain here, and whoever that was there that day was looking off at Charlotte. You don't see that many clear days now where you can see Charlotte, but that's looking at Charlotte in the distance. And but Kings Mountain is not nearly that high. Looking at Draper's book, he has an illustration in there that shows not really Kings Mountain, but Crowder's Mountain. And a lot of the old books carry pictures of Crowder's Mountain, not Kings Mountain in the illustration. Kings Mountain is this little low-lying mountain in the background there. It's not nearly as high. And this old building, Dr. Bobby Moss, who authored the book on Kings Mountain, tells me that was the old post office, and it was a log structure. And I took this picture back in the 70s, and it's been torn down or moved many years ago. But this was on the road into Kings Mountain. Of course, you have a number of monuments up there today. And if you're there in October, the 7th, 6th and 7th, of the 7th, when it came in, that afternoon the battles fought, they have some activities going on and encampment during that time. Now, what happened at Kings Mountain? Well, we know that Ferguson lost and was killed there and is buried there. And we know it was very much a civil war. And we know that the aftermath was that it was very hard to recruit loyalists after then. Patrick Ferguson was the only person there from the British Isles. The rest were Americans. Now, some were provincials in the British Army, but many of the on the British side were American militia, loyalist militia, and you could not tell them apart if you just saw them out somewhere. But the British wore a sprig of pine in their hats, and the Americans wore some kind of paper that they had in their hats to tell each other apart. Why did Ferguson choose Kings Mountain? Well, he was embarrassed by Musgrove Bill, Frank, I think, for one thing. He had to make some kind of statement. We don't know why. One of the early stories was, well, he chose that because its name was Kings Mountain. There was a family who lived there named King, and he chose it for king and God and country. That's maybe part of it, but for one thing, he could not get back to Cornwallis, and he couldn't get a message to Cornwallis. Cornwallis was in the Hornet's Nest at the time, which was Charlotte. And Charlotte was a small, Charlottetown was a small village surrounded by thick forests. And the Scotch-Irish and some of the German militia had the roads really covered in and out of Charlottetown. Tarleton was not far away, but Tarleton did not come to the aid of Ferguson. If he'd come to his aid, that might have been a different story too. Some people say he just procrastinated. Some people said he was ill. But for some reason, he didn't come to the aid of Ferguson. Ferguson, some of the historians said he was trying to escape the battle. Now the battle, the mountain is sort of a long, flat mountain. And it rises a little, and there's a higher point to that mountain. Well, this is why I think the British lost. Ferguson had sent 6 men up to that higher point to rally those men. They were running low on ammunition. Now, Draper and Usall Johnson, who was a doctor with the British, said that they ran out of ammunition at that point. Well, not at that point. He didn't know they were low on ammunition, and Ferguson had 2 lines of men in the rear who had probably 18 shots apiece, 18 musket balls apiece. And they hadn't come into the battle yet. So he had to go up, send somebody up on the higher point to rally these men. He sent 3 or 4 men, and as soon as they got in their horses, they were shot out of the saddle. And so that left it to Ferguson to do that. As soon as he got in his horse, he was shot out of the saddle with 6 or more musket balls. As he fell out of his saddle, and getting shot that many times, he would just, plunged out of his saddle. And his foot caught in the stirrup, and he was dragged by his horse. Now, the horse, there was a road up. The way they'd come up, there was a road, and there was a huge rock there. Some of the rocks have been moved up there. I think this one's still there. And that's where he had his tent and his headquarters. And his horse pulled him down the hill beside that headquarters down and didn't stop until it got to the bottom of the hill. And that's exactly where he's buried, right at that, pretty much that point where his horse stopped. Buried there, and I don't know how many people over the years have thrown stones on that grave, thinking, well, this is Ferguson, and we're throwing stones on the grave. When what it was an old Scottish custom to put stones on the grave to keep wolves out and predators out of the graves. I think that's another group of slides. The Civil War, very much so, took place in Rutherford County. It hurt recruiting for loyalists. At the Battle of Cowpens, later, one reason they said that Tarleton rushed the attack was he thought a group of Over-Mountain men were coming, as it happened at Kings Mountain. What he didn't know, that some of those Over-Mountain men were already there. Now, not that many that fought at Kings Mountain were at Cowpens later, but some of the same ones were. There were some who fought there. I've never figured out exactly how many fought at Kings Mountain that fought at Cowpens also. And Hammond's Store was a prelude to Cowpens, as Musgrove's Mill was to Kings Mountain. I'll just end with that. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Ferguson had a silver whistle with which he directed his men. Some people said he also had a conch shell, too. I'm not sure. There is one in a museum in Tennessee that they think maybe he had. But he had a silver whistle. He was very identifiable, and he wore a sort of a vest-like thing that day. People knew who to look for. Knew what he looked like. The Over-Mountain men did. But that silver whistle still exists. And it's private ownership, and I'm not sure that they're going to put that on display. I've heard that somebody has it in western North Carolina.
Body was treated after the battle. Would you care to comment?
Well, Patrick Kelly said all that's not true. I heard him speak at the Cowpens. His books are back there, I believe. That the Over-Mountain men did not urinate on the body, and that some of that story is just false. At one point, the body was supposed to have been exhumed, and I don't know what they were trying to find out, how many musket balls hit him or what, but Patrick O'Kelly says that's not true either from what he's learned, but I'm not sure about that one. I think at one time maybe it was dug up.
I read one account that said the body was exhumed, or at least that there was an archaeological type of dig,
Yeah.
and that he was buried with his sword, which would indicate he was buried with honors, as opposed to. But I just didn't know what he knew about that.
He had two mistresses there at the battle too. One of the stories is that one of the women, Virginia Sal, I believe, one of them was buried with him. So they may have been trying to find out that too. Find out a number of things by that. So I don't know. There was a story, I think it was in the 1930s that was supposed to have taken place. I've heard a number of stories on that, but I'm not sure of the truth there.
That a lot of times that the church that they were members of had an influence on whether they were going to be, which side they were going to take, and whether or not they were going to show up. You know, there were a lot of loyalists around Fair Forest Creek from that Baptist church there, but a lot of the Presbyterian churches were split. Just because you're Scotch-Irish Presbyterian doesn't mean you're a patriot. And so you get a lot of after the war, you get a lot of Presbyterians who were loyalists who were not welcome back in their church. And so that's where all these Baptist and Methodist churches came from in South Carolina, is that they were forced out. And so, I think that's an element of it. And of course, those that took parole in Charleston, they were, with the revocation, in essence, of the parole, they were forced into taking a side when they didn't want to at that point. I wish there was a nice, easy answer, but I don't think there is an easy answer to why they show up or don't, or what it is about. Sumter, to me, doesn't seem to be somebody I would have cared for, but yet he was obviously a really charismatic guy. I mean, if you can talk that many people into coming and getting their tails kicked every time he leads them into battle, just about, you must be doing something right.
And accounts seem to be that when he goes out there, and he was doing this even from early in the Revolution, he was notable for his recruiting ability. People are willing to follow him. I think that's certainly true, yes.
But his plunder practices must have been popular.
Mhm. Certainly people were able to get some things that way. yeah.
Draper goes into great long lists of who got what when,
Mhm.
and it was good.
Of course, we've still got all these old leftover animosities. We've got, as you say, the greed, the opportunity to get some new stuff. Upcountry, of course, was traditionally a turbulent place anyway. You don't need to have anything new going on to make you feel like being upset at somebody and doing something about it. Still, I think what you're seeing here at the same time, in the way these battles operate, something's going on that happens to be the crystal around which things coalesce, and all of a sudden you've got a force in being that's able to do something of that nature, to strike like that, and to have an impact like that, and to disperse afterwards, and then to come back together. Not always the same people coming back together at the same time, and not always the same militia colonels leading them in at the same time. But you're going to find them coming back and forth like that. Yes, sir, back in the back.
I think your two Western victories probably each had a colonel around which the Patriot forces gathered. I think Kings Mountain, as was pointed out by the speaker, the colonel that caused the gathering that time was Ferguson's threat to go over the mountain and burn, kill, and otherwise tear up the area. In the case of Cowpens, I think the fact that you have Morgan and some of the Continental Line actually in the area probably caused a lot of the militia that was there to come out saying, okay, this time we've actually got some of the regular army. We've got one of the more charismatic, forceful commanders in the regular army. This is somebody we can go fight with. I mean, Morgan had been a rifleman too. That probably didn't hurt any when you were talking about the men armed with rifles.
And he had a reputation left over from Saratoga as a winner.
Yeah.
Tom, I've never counted how many times the Over Mountain been mobilized, but I think it came to South Carolina at least 3 times. And would y'all comment on the role of General McDowell and the North Carolina rebel government that was obviously fully functional? Because we've been focusing like these colonels just made this up on their own, but they had commissions, and they were obviously answering, I guess, to General McDowell, and they were answering to the rebel governor of North Carolina at the time.
William, Shelby, and Clark took their marching orders from McDowell. They made the request. I don't think they would have moved into South Carolina if McDowell had not approved it. So they were pretty clearly answering to McDowell. And we believe that the messenger was sent from McDowell. And from what we know, most of those troops that were at Musgrove Mill moved back into North Carolina to reform up with McDowell.
Is that true at Kings Mountain, Cowpens also?
At Kings Mountain, it's my understanding that there was some disagreement over McDowell's leadership, and that's when leadership passed to Campbell. Is that correct? And I'm not sure what the beef it was with his leadership there. I got some of the McDowells mixed up. There are 2 or 3 of them.
Mountain was not the McDowell at but I mean there were 2 McDowells at Cowpens. The Quaker Meadows McDowell and the Pleasant Garden McDowell. Their names are what? Joseph
and Charles.
Okay, but wasn't it William McDowell that was at Kings Mountain?
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
And which McDowell was commanding at Earl's Ford? Was that William?
I think it was William. Yeah.
So they were mad at him because of his poor security and got that young, was it a Hammond, Noel Hammond, who was killed in his sleep by the way, by Dunlap, which the Georgians did in later.
Yeah.
And he deserved it.
Yeah. Also at Earl's Ford, one of the Hamptons from Rutherford County was killed, Elijah
I'm
Hampton,
sorry.
I believe.
It may have been a Hampton. A young boy was killed, his name was Noah, and his father.
Noah Hampton, yes, Noah Hampton.
And his father never forgave McDowell for the poor security.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was the same McDowell that,
Well, the McDowell I'm speaking of is General Quaker, not as McDowell. He was the militia commander of the Western North Carolina district. And they stayed on patrol most of the time against the Cherokees, of course, which they had to keep in bay. And, but it was he, I guess, who on the order of the governor was dispatching men. So there was, in other words, my point is there was more than a coordination on a county militia permanent basis. There was at least the governor of North Carolina, and in the case of Kings Mountain, where you have Virginians, I guess, you've got an even greater coordination going on there.
I heard Dr. Larry Babbitt speak the first year we had this meeting, the Francis Marion Symposium. He talked on the bus on one of the field trips, and he talked about there being a real networking system among the militia, maybe an informal system, but for example, some of the captains were, they chose millers, people who had grist mills, because they would be able to plan ahead and procure some of the foodstuffs for the Army. And he talked about, this is the regular Army, talking about Nathaniel Greene coming in and would prepare and stay one day and, you know, move out, you know, stay 2 or 3 days. Well, the militia had some organization behind it. Maybe not always evident, but like I think you're saying.
As a follow-up question, really, to his, I'm wondering what the method of communication was, other than just throwing some guy on a horse and saying right up there to check in with so-and-so. When you consider that, for instance, the Georgians were in Augusta, or the Augusta area, led by Clark, and there obviously was a good, strong communication and a relationship between Clark and then these others all went to Watauga, because he led his people out of Augusta after the fall of the fort, and they literally went, took them 11 days to get from Augusta to Elizabethton, what is now Elizabethton, Tennessee. That's where they took the 400 women and children. And the 30 Georgians split off to fight at Kings Mountain. But I'm curious how they got that all figured out. If there's ever been any information passed down, how did they figure out to meet at the river, get up there and join one another? And I've always understood the real reason Ferguson was where he was is he was actually trying to catch Clark before he could join up. That was one of the primary reasons for his push west. You had a comment?
I think they were so afraid of Clark, especially, and afraid that the fort at 96, Stark Fort, would be attacked. The British mentioned that over and over, fear of and that was a fear before Cowpens too, that they would attack the fort at 96.
But Clark had to have had a much smaller group of men. That's what I find surprising, is that they were so afraid of Elijah Clark when South Carolina had a larger population to draw from, North Carolina did, and even Western Virginia. And, you know, Augusta was the wild frontier. Who were you going to draw from?
I'm not sure of all that fear of Clark. Why?
at Musgrove's Mill, before Clark and Shelby moved away, they agreed that the way to deal with Ferguson was to mass the militia. And they decided that they would keep in touch, Clark and Shelby. Then when Shelby got the ultimatum, he and Clark, I think it was Shelby who went to church and dragged Sevier out of his service to explain to him what was going on. But the Georgians had joined other militia, like at Thickety Ford and the Second Battle of Cedar Springs, whatever. And evidently, Clark may have been illiterate at that point, but he certainly was savvy, sort of like Morgan was. And he understood that the only way that they could stand against Ferguson was if they joined forces. And so what happened at Kings Mountain was almost planned at Musgrove's Mill before they went their own way. And the Georgians were all over South Carolina. I mean, there might not have been a tremendous number of them, but they keep showing up as individuals or as small groups. There were only 30 at Kings Mountain, but there were 75 of them at Cowpens. many of them the same people, I think.
Let me follow up Chris. I think one thing that Patrick O'Kelly's books have been particularly useful for is tracking the careers of these guys, because we're talking about 1780, but a lot of these leaders knew each other for years, some of them going back to the French and Indian War they had fought together. And so while they may have been geographically dispersed, a lot of them had done common campaigning, working together in 1760, and then in militia musters, royal militias. And so 1780 is a snapshot of people, a lot of them knew each other.
There's something that I've always wondered about. My fourth great-grandfather fought at the Battle of Stone Oak, as did some other western North Carolina men. Now, can you imagine somebody coming from the mountains of North Carolina and going down there and seeing alligators for the first time and cottonmouth moccasins and who knows what all, and fighting that area? How did they get down there and why? I don't understand all myself, all
The Carolina backcountry militia stopped Cornwallis at Breach Inlet in the first attack on Charleston in 1776. And those are the guys from here. The leader of that was William Danger Thompson of Belleville Plantation, which is right over there at McCord's Ferry on Highway 601 on the other side of the river from here. So it's the people from here in Clarendon County who went down to Isle of Palms to stop Cornwallis. And so these people, and that's in 1776, but they didn't just meet each other then. They were drilling militias.
And don't forget the Catawba Indians were there too. They were there in 76, and they were there at Hanging Rock. I mean, they were an integral part of all this. We tend to ignore them.
Anybody else have some thoughts on that? Scott, were you about to say something?
I'm amazed at some of the distances covered and the knowledge of acquaintances, like you say, across the South.
Well, their families were probably related to each other back in Ireland, and there's certainly a lot of them related to each other in Pennsylvania when they came down here. It's not that big a population.
But it is odd the number of York County people that had wagons at Stone Oak. I don't know how you talk them into doing that, but I mean, it's in their audited account that they lost a horse or something, and they weren't in any regular regiment.
What sort of association did they have then? What kind of regiment are they associated with?
That was a new acquisition militia, wasn't it?
I don't know.
Yeah, it was the new acquisition
number
militia.
What they were in, but it's just
Right.
following names that I
Right.
run into.
Well, one thing you get is Presbyterians have an educated ministry, professionally educated ministry, and they believe in colleges, and that's why we have Davidson and Presbyterian College and some of these other old institutions. So you got a lot of literate people. And literate people can be better records keepers, and so 30 years later and 20 years later, and they get elected to the legislature, they file all these claims. And so we just have better records from people who were more literate, better records keepers. So the new acquisition is full of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who know how to read and write.
And within the Presbyterians, there were elite groups, leaders like the Jacksons and the others that had been so in Ireland too, and the Calhouns and others when they came to America. They tended to be the ones who would write down some history also.
And of course, it always matters who writes the history. Do we have a question here?
How often does one try to exploit British sources on any of this? It seems to me they have professional historians, especially military historians, of their virtues, and they lost, and they must have some reasons for it. And I haven't heard anything that seems to resonate from any of those kinds of sources. And I was just wondering how the Brits literature fits into the study of what I think is a very neglected part of the Revolution.
Well, we looked at British literature a lot in the study of Mr. Mill. We used the Cornwallis papers, and extensively to do a historic resource study before we begin to develop the park. And to look at the second part of your question, the Patriot Forces reported an astounding victory where they drove the British from the field, and the British respond to Musgrove Mill by saying that they retreated quietly but prevented the Patriots from holding the field. The real truth is, everybody ran. The British went south and the Patriots went north.
It just seems to me,
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm gonna take some pictures.
What you just heard is what the troops heard every morning in the Revolutionary War. This is reveille, normally played by the Fife and drums and anybody else in the morning. Fifers and drummers had really a bunch of duty calls. We're going to do a few samples tonight. Again, this was reveille, the first thing they did in the morning. There were about 3 other main groupings they had during the day. They trooped, which means they assembled and had inspection. In the afternoon, they had retreat, which is not like the cavalry coming back across the hill. Retreat was everybody coming back and grouping in the afternoon. So they played a little tune for that. Then at night, they played tattoo, or also called tap two. The tap two word came, I think, from a Dutch word, and it was used at the end of the day when the guys maybe were at the taverns, and it was time to push the tap two, quit drinking, and come back to camp. So that's kind of where that came from, and I think our word for taps nowadays came originally from that. So we'll go through and we're going to play, just like I said, a sample. The next thing we're going to do is country dance, which is what they used to play when they're getting ready to inspect the troops. Okay? French derivation. Actually, the British started playing Yankee Doodle to make fun of those American colonists, those doodles that were in the United States and weren't really very good at anything. So that's kind of where it came from. Then the Americans took it up and they played it really just to throw it back at the British and make fun of them. Okay, so here we go, Yankee Doodle.
March is Turkish March. Okay. One thing, there was a lot of influence from Turkey as far as music and the revolution. Cymbals were a big thing, big drums, and like that. So Turkish March kind of derives and gives you a flavor of some of the influences that the colonists were subject to. Turkish March.
I think everybody who retires becomes semi-retired. As I talk to people, I found that that you get involved more after you retire than when you were working. So we're glad to have you here this morning, Valley. Semi-retired civil engineer, is that correct? Good. And he's here to speak to us about the Catawba Path.
Y'all's theme dealing with Francis Marion and the Revolution fits right.
Is that going to bother you?
Things right angle it or down it or something. If I get over it.
Angle it up, and I'm going to. Is that any good?
Does that work? Yeah, that's right. Look at it. Now, my general topic here deals peripherally with all this because what I'm going to talk to you about.
Can we hear you a little better, please?
Oh, yeah, that may be a problem. I need that bullhorn. I'll just try to talk up a little bit better. I'm going to talk about a man who made a journey through South Carolina in 1701. He started at Charleston, and he ended up in essentially Bath, North Carolina. He made a big horseshoe movement through the countryside, and in 1709 he published a book called A New Voyage to Carolina. And this story is not particularly well known, but it's significant that this book was published in 1709 and it's still being published. This is brand new right here. So there's a lot of interest in John Lawson. And what I did over the last 30 or so years was attempt to find out where Lawson went, because when he made his trip, he published a very fine journal of his trip talking about all he saw, the plants, the animals, the people, the countryside, but the man did not know where he was. He didn't have a clue once he got out of Charleston. So we've never known where John Lawson was. So that's what I spent a lot of years doing, and we basically finished that now, and we're working on some of the other little things like who was with him and all that sort of stuff, because he didn't tell that either. He had 5 Europeans with him, he never told the name of one of them. And that was a sly move on his part that he would get credit for it, basically. But anyhow, what I want to show you is the part of Lawson's trip through South Carolina. There's a lot of parallels and a lot of connections to what happened, 75 years or 80 years later in the Revolutionary War. Anyhow, the real significance of this book and why it's still out and being published is that John Lawson made his trip in 1701. Well, in 1711, that started what we call the Indian Wars in the Southeast. And after 1720, they lasted about 1711 to 1720. After 1720, the native people who lived here had been so dispersed and displaced and killed off and moved around that they no longer inhabited where they'd been for many, many years, and they no longer practiced many of their Aboriginal customs. So Lawson's information about these people was really useful to understanding what the native people were like here before they were so decimated by the colonials. So I'm going to have some slides here, which you look right. I hope I'm going the right way. Nope, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. Okay, all right. Here's the front cover of his 1709 book. Now, published in London. It was published that year first, and then for a number of years after that by the people in London. It's also published in German and by the Swiss. Here's where we believe the pompous gentleman himself is. We just found this thing about, 5 or 6 years ago, and one of these truckloads of material, art that came out of England. And somebody from art professor from East Carolina University saw this and did not even know who he was at first. But after getting the picture out and studying, the little card the man's holding in his hand says John. It's upside down, purposely. It says John Lawson on it. So, you know, we found a lot out about John Lawson in the last 10 years, and this is one of the really significant things, is what the guy looked like. He looks just like what his personality is, a pompous Englishman. and hard-headed. He was only, he was only 20, born in 1675, so in 1701, he was only 25, 26 years old, very young. The time his picture was taken, he was taken at even about 33 or 34. Now Lawson traveled from Charleston up to the Santee River, and then took the Santee River up, partially at first by boat, and then he walked the rest of the way. And his trip on this particular slide is shown as a dotted line coming out up the river from Charleston, up the coast from Charleston and up the river. But the solid line on there is the subject of the title of that particular slide, and that is the route of the Great Catawba Trading Path. It was the path that the people took that were trading with the native people in the interior of the Carolinas for deerskin. The deerskin trade was the way to make money in the early colonial days. You made a lot of money trading European goods and native people for deerskin. The deerskins were shipped, of course, to Europe, and there was a lot of profit in it. So many people got involved in that trade. And the route from Charleston to the interior to Charlotte, basically, because Charlotte was the hub of native activity, probably the biggest native concentration of people in the country at the time. And this route became known as the Great Catawba Trading Path. And Lawson followed this route part of the way, and then he hit it actually right on the Santee River, and he followed it the rest of the way to North Carolina. Of course, in colonial times, this route was the principal road between Charleston and the upcountry. So it was still in use at that time. This is supposed to be Charleston, about 1708, slightly after Lawson was there. Small boats you see right there is what Lawson started out. He left Charleston on December the 28th, 1700, the day after his birthday. He had with him 3 Indians, and the wife of the Indian guy, one of the guides, and he had with him 5 Englishmen. So there was 10 people in all in the trip starting up the river. He contacted with, of course, he picked up his guides in Charleston. It was probably, the first guides were probably Seaweed Indians who were always hanging around Charleston, basically trying to get work. So it was not They spent 2 or 3 days going up the coast. They got to Bull's Island, spent the first night on Bull's Island, and here where Lawson's hard-headedness first comes in. He tried to go across what's Bull's Bay, just straight across to what we call now Raccoon Key, and across the open water of the bay, and the wind was coming from the lands that was blowing them out in the ocean, so they had to fight to get back to Bull's Island without being blown out in the ocean. They spent a second night on Bull's Island, then they used their heads a little bit better. They went in next to the creeks, and followed the creeks all the way up through by McClellanville and up to the South Santee River at about where Alligator Creek comes in, if you know anything about geography. That's a modern day topo map of South Santee where Lawson went into Alligator Creek. The mouth of the Santee is out this way. And then they took the boat and they went up the river. He says 2 leagues, which would be about 6 miles. That's probably further than he actually went. But they were rowing against the current. It was a flood time, and they were rowing against the current, so they had a hard time getting any distance at all up the river. And here's where Lawson gave up on the idea of going up the river by boat. He had the idea that our rivers were like those in England, so they could go up, and have a port, an inland port, much as London is. And he had fanciful ideas of real estate development. Anyhow, they gave that up. They got out on land right above, right at Wambaugh Creek, which is right above the, what's the plantation for, what's that big plantation there called? No, the one,
Hampton.
Hampton, yeah, Hampton's place, yeah. Okay, they got right out above that, and they met some Europeans there who were settled there, and that was the, that's the South Santee, that's the river they were on. They met the Siouxsie Indians first, over on the deer hunt. They heard the cane being fired, it sounded like guns to Lawson, but they actually, the Indians were burning off the cane to drive the deer, in a deer hunt. When they got off the river, they went up Wambaugh Creek to a man's name who Lawson called Monsieur Eugene. And who this turned out to be was Daniel Eugene, who was one of the French Huguenots and one of the earlier ones to settle on the Santee River. He settled there in 1696. And his place is now called the Point Plantation. It's a part of, there's nothing left there, but it's a part of something National Forest down there, Francis-Marion National Forest. Lawson spent the night with Mr. Eugene, and the next morning they walked. They started walking. They walked up the south side of the Santee River toward the community of Jamestown. And they spent all day walking. It happened to be a Sunday. And so they met a lot of people coming from church that day. And Lawson talked about people coming from church, and he talked about the church. And it's from Lawson's description that we know where the first Huguenot church on the Santee River was. Lawson made it to just below the present town of Santee by dark that evening, and he got to another Huguenot house owned by a man you call Monsieur Guillaume, who turned out to be Joachim Gilliard, the eldest of the Gilliards in this country. And they spent the night there. Now the route he traveled that day, we know where he started at Eugene's place, we know where he ended up at Gilliard's place. And by knowing this information, we were able to figure out how far Lawson walked in a day. This man was a terrible exaggerator in his book. He normally talked about walking 20 to 30 miles a day. Well, this was January, and they were only walking during daylight, so they only had limited hours to travel. And they walked less than 14 and a half miles a day on an average day. So that's one of the big keys we got in trying to interpret how far Lawson went every day and where he ended up. Without that, we would have been, and everybody before us had looked for these people, looked for Lawson's route. They've always used the 20 miles or 25 miles a day, so it's thrown them way off. By knowing these 2 days together where he was on land, we were able to hem in this distance much better. About 100 and a few years later, a man named Thomas Gilliard made a map of the original Jamestown settlement. And this is it.
Move the podium to the side.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm probably going to get somebody away no matter where I go.
Now we can see your screen.
Okay. Is it y'all all right here? Okay. Thomas Gilliard made this map in the early 1800s of the original settlement of Jamestown, and this shows the church and how they had laid out the lots and everything. Of course, the original settlement floundered because it got flooded frequently and they never did develop it right. But anyway, it was laid out, there was some lots bought and everything. And another part of the map he made was this, what is basically a blow-up of it, and he shows two creeks that look like a chicken wishbone there. And this is the only historical document that collaborates Lawson's trip beside this creek. If you look at the far, my left creek there, the writing there says, large swamp navigated by Lawson. There's nothing else in literature that survived that collaborates that Lawson ever made this trip, except his book. But we found this in History and Archives here in Columbia, and this is our little hint, so we also know, where the man's house was that he spent the night with. The house is a little black dot on the other fork of the creek there. The next morning they got out and they crossed the Santee River in small boats, and the Santee was flooded, the whole swamp was flooded. They went across the river up a little ways, cut into the swamp, and got lost. and they had an Indian guide. He said he was lost. So what happened was they let Lawson and one other fellow out on a little high piece of land in the middle of the swamp, and the rest of them went and found land. And just before dark, the Indian came back, and he was drunk, so Lawson said he knew he'd found land. Got him an Indian guide, they went to high land, and they came out at a house that belonged to the son of the elder Gilliard they'd spent the night before with. And his name was Bartholomew Gilliard. And he had a place on the north side of the river. He was trading with the Indians for deer skins over there. And there were 5 or 6 of the French Huguenots there. They all were pretty tipsy, I think. And Lawson, of course, doesn't admit it, but I think he got in the same fashion. And they decided they were going to travel about 2 more miles to the Indian town, which is in the community of Suttons on what's now called Weetee Lake. And so they got out, they left probably after dark. They walked a couple of miles. They had to cross Weetee Creek. And the guy in front of him, and then Lawson too, fell into the creek, trying to cross a log crossing probably because they were a bit tipsy. And Lawson said he liked to froze to death that night because they didn't get the clothes, all the bedding was wet in the Indian town. They didn't get warm till they got by a big fire the next morning in the Indian village. This is a shot of Weetee Lake, very, very pretty little oxbow lake right there in the community of Suttons on the Cooper property. Lawson left Weetee Lake the next morning and walked up, or tried to walk up the Santee River, but because the river was flooded, they had to take a detour, and they went around to the east about, he said, 10 miles out of the road, which is pretty close. They ended up that night in Gordine, where the railroad now crosses the road on the east side of the Santee River, off these 375 is the highway number. Spent one night there. The next night they walked the next day about noon, they crossed the road at Mount Hope Swamp, which I believe is some revolutionary engagement there at Mount Hope Swamp. So this is a picture of the road at Mount Hope Swamp. Now the road is in the exact same place it's always been. It's probably been there since, Mississippian times, 1,000 years ago. We don't think it's moved at all. It's the narrowest point across Mount Hope Swamp. It's not paved yet. That's what it looks like at the bridge. This is what it looks like right after you cross the bridge. We think this is the original native road up the east side of the swamp. And of course, it was still there in Revolutionary times. So it would have been the road that was used by the colonials. All right, a couple more nights, and Lawson came into what is now Clarendon County, which I understand George you want me to spend some time with, so I'll talk about this a little bit. This is a copy of Mills Atlas for Sumter District, which Clarendon was a part of. Lawson spent one night on Meeting House Creek, which is one of the insignificant little creeks along what is called the Old River Road. Is everybody familiar with the geography we're talking about here? Some of you are probably. It really helps to know the geography here. We spent a night here. All right, fancy. Thank you. We got all this. Yeah. We spent a night here, one night right here. They started walking the next day, and they got to it'd be Waibu Creek. And at Waibu Creek, once they crossed Waibu Creek, they started encountering the houses or the plantations, as Lawson called them, of the Santee Indian people. And now, when you come in, this is basically still the river road, it's in the same place. But once you cross, where's Waibu? I guess it's Waibu right there. Once you cross Waibu, it's flooded. The old road is flooded right there. It's flooded at Waibu, it's flooded at Potato Creek, and it's flooded at Wambach Creek. It's called the River Road, the sections of it that is still present. Now, Lawson crossed Waibu, came into the Indian settlements, and at just about a half a mile before Wambach Creek, he came to the king, what he called the king of the Santees, and he spent a long time talking with this man through interpreters, and he spent 2 or 3 pages in the book explaining about these people's culture, and it's very, very interesting because these people are undoubtedly the descendants of the people of the Mississippian culture in South Carolina, and it's my contention that this is the place where De Soto in 1540 found the province or the capital town of Talamico of the province of Crutchfield. And you all familiar with that story? I'm kind of out in left field with this, because my partner in this book, he thinks it's somewhere else, so we argue about it all the time. But if you know anything about the trip of DeSoto into the southeast in 1540, when he came out of Florida, he found this large kingdom, if you will, of native people. He was looking for gold, of course, he didn't find any gold. But he found these people, and we've always been in doubt about where this was. Well, we're still in doubt about it. But the things that we found, partially through Lawson, and some later stuff I found him just actually last few months, I am fairly certain that where Lawson found the Santee people is where DeSoto found the people of Crutchfield. All right, so Lawson talked with him till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He left, and then they had to cross Wambar Creek. He said it was a deep creek, and they liked to drown getting across and all sort of thing. And they spent the night right about here. And this is you see, look at this road right here. That road right there is the road coming from Charleston, known as Nelson's Ferry. You know, I guess some of you at least would know where that was. That's the road. That's the main road coming from Charleston right there. And that then, once you hit that road and you start on up this way, then you're on what was the Catawba Path. All right, so from there on into North Carolina, Lawson is traveling on the Catawba Path. He spent this particular night in a building called a hickaroo, or black house. That was the Indian name, hickaroo, black house, what the English called it. This is what it looked like. Not what we typically think about South Carolina Indian dwellings, but these folks had to get out of the cold weather in the middle of winter just like we do. So what they did was build a slightly submerged earthen lodge, much like the Mandan people were still building in the 1800s on the upper Missouri River. Alrighty, and these buildings were much more common in the South than we think of them being. They were fairly large. They had no windows in them, hence the Europeans called them a black house, and they had just an opening for let the smoke out at the top. The one complaint about Lawson, about what Lawson said about it, he said it was full of fleas. So the dogs were also getting out of the cold, so that was a problem. Let me back up now to this. See what else here. All right, Lawson went the next morning after spending the night in the black house. The next morning they got up and started walking. Now they're walking up the east side of the Santee River. I-95 is right about here. This is where I-95 now crosses the lake, okay? Between where Lawson spent the night and what is the Scott's Mound right there. The Fort Watson Mound, the battle site, Fort Watson, was of course a Mississippian site. It was a part, I think it was a major part of the Indian province of Crutchfield there, all right? And the Spanish talk about this mound, or these mounds that were there. Then, between Nelson's Ferry and the Scott's Mound was the Indian town. And Lawson walked up the road. He didn't actually see Scott's Mound, because when you're walking on the Catawba Path and the later Colonial Road, you actually miss it about maybe between a quarter and a half a mile. It's stuck out on the edge next to the river there, and the path misses it. It goes up, crosses 301, goes on, winds on up toward around the edge of the Navajo Lake and up toward Jack's Creek. So he missed seeing it, but he knew that the mounds were there because of this discussion with Indians. So they went a little bit further to spend the night below the Richardson Graveyard. That's another site y'all have mentioned. The Richardson Graveyard. They spent the next night just below that, and there's some very curious depressions along the road there that don't drain. And the only kind of depressions we usually have in South Carolina that don't drain are called Carolina Bays, right? But these things are not Carolina Bays, and they're still there, lots of them. And he said the road passed through the middle of one of these things, so we had to try to find the one that he's talking about. We think we found it. It's one that has been drained by a ditch now. But now he's going up this, what is now just a country road, and I can't even remember the number of the road right now. And that's the Catawba Path. It does go by the Richardson Graveyard. Right? I'm going the wrong way, sorry. There's the Fort Watson Mound, part of where I think was Confederate jacket that Lawson passed fairly close to. About 10 o'clock the next morning, Lawson came into a hunting camp. And the hunting camp was at another colonial skirmish site, I guess it is. It's at Halfway Swamp. It's right at Halfway Swamp. Halfway Swamp has some high ground on the upper side, and it's the place where the South Carolina Waterfowl Association now has their headquarters. And so anyhow, at this time, 1701, the Santee people were in a hunting camp there, and what they did is they would leave town in the fall, where they lived in the fall, and they'd go out maybe anywhere from 10 to 20 miles away from town. They'd set up buildings that looked like, basically like tents. See, this is not like their conventional dwellings. It looked more like a tent. And they would stay there off and on most of the winter and go hunting, go deer hunting. It's kind of strange that we kind of do the same thing, right? Only we limit it to weekends now. Our guys come to my place, they're there every weekend, you know. And the best part about the whole thing is they got a house to stay in for their hunting trip. But yeah, Lawson found this hunting camp, picked up a new guide, and headed on up the river. If you know where the Pinewood landfill is, a hazardous waste landfill, the road running by it is the path, the cobble path there. And in trying to figure out where it was in this particular area, I went to Archives and History, and I found a land grant to a man named William Leonard in 1749, and on that land grant, marked in yellow here, it says the old Catawba Path. All right, so this is part of the way we found out where this route was. Well, then you got to take this and put it on the ground. So we went to the soil survey maps of the counties. The counties all have soil survey maps. And we looked for the circular things here, which are the Carolina Bays. You see there's lots of them on this picture, a lot of Carolina Bays. So we had to find 3 Carolina Bays that matched the Carolina Bays on the old land grant. And this is the present highway, present paved road that actually passed right through the middle of the land grant. Now, if you look at this is a modern topographic map. And if you look at it, you can see here's the highway right here, here's the land grant, and the Catawba Path passed off to the edge here, and once I set it up, that's the way it looks. I tried to figure out, well, why is that? And there's a dirt road right here, and so I rode down the dirt road, and there's a house there, belongs to the Touchberry family, and I asked Mr. Touchberry, I says, are there any old roads around here? And he said, well, there's one in my backyard. So we walked out and looked at it, and that's the Catawba Path running through this man's backyard right there. So this is how we put together part of our little story, using these records in the history and archives. Okay, so Lawson knows after the hunting camp, they went on up, they didn't stop, they were walking through here, they went up, and they went into, if you know where Mill Creek State Park is, it's a fairly small state park right north of that Pinewood facility. They went into Mill Creek State Park, and to stop by a stream to spend the night. And the road here, running off the main paved road now, is a dirt road. This is the Catawba Path. This is the Colonial Highway, called the Kings Road. It's the old Charleston Road, what's on it now. And this thing is still here. It goes into Poinsett State Park, or goes by Poinsett State Park. Lawson spent the night on a creek below Poinsett State Park, and when he got there, he noticed that there was a rock in the bottom of the creek, which he said was so light he couldn't believe it would precipitate any place but where it naturally grew. And when you get to this particular creek called Tavern Creek, and you look, and there's a rock all along the banks and in the creek, and you pick it up, it's very, very light. It's made out of fuller's earth, which is the same material as pine wood. It's a cemented clay stone. A cemented clay stone. It's right there in the creek where Lawson talked about it. He said it was, he called it like unto Tripoli stone, Tripoli being, where it's in North Africa, right? So he'd seen something similar to it before. So yeah, you can go right where Lawson spent the night there, And you can see the stone outcropping right up next to the creek and it down in the creek there. It's still there. The road's still there. This is the great trading path. Been there for 1,000 years. It's the colonial road that colonials used, and we still got it. So we're fortunate in some respects. About 3.5 miles above this creek, this Tavern Creek, the Catawba Path slides off to the west and stays right next to the river swamp. And the Colonial Road now comes out, is slightly to the east, maximum point probably 3/4 to a mile to the east, and it's the dirt road you just saw. The path turns off of it, and it's right next to the swamp. And if you can tell, there's a gully running right down through there, and I've drawn an arrow down through it right there. And this gully is coming down a hill, and this is the Catawba Path. It's going down the hill into Poinsett State Park and about to cross Shanks Creek. Shanks Creek is a stream that's dammed up in Poinsett, and that's what the main part of the park is, the swimming hole and everything. But this gully coming down here is the old Catawba Path, and it's probably, it didn't even get used but a very short time for colonial use because it was too close to the swamp. It stayed too wet down there. So they moved further up the hill to get away from the wet ground so they could use their wagons, their wheel traffic, right? The native people didn't have a use for wheel traffic. Colonials needed wheel traffic, needed a road for wheel traffic, so they moved their road up the hill. And this is a place where that occurred. Partially, that was the main reason. The other partial reason, when a man named Matthew Singleton land granted this piece of property, he privatized a section of the road. He probably tried to charge a toll there at first. That was pretty common, you know. If you maintain a section of road, you charge a toll. So this is just a conglomerate of several plats, the Singleton. This is the Catawba Path, right way across the Shanks Creek is now the pond of Poinsett State Park. Ready? That evening, Lawson got to Poinsett State Park, and once you cross Shanks Creek, on the other side, there's a place they call the Overlook now for the park. And so they climbed up on this hill, and when Lawson got up on the hill, he said it was the most amazing prospect he had seen since he'd been in Carolina. And he was on this big hill overlooking the Wateree and the Congaree swamps. And if you go up there today, you can see the same thing he saw. Go up in the wintertime, this is a summer shot here. You go up in the wintertime and you look out and you see the brown of the river swamp. It's brown, and on the other side, way over there, which Lawson said was 20 miles, really isn't but 5, you can see the green pine trees on the other side, but the swamp is all brown. And Lawson looked up to the northwest and he said there was an alf up there that looked like a sugar loaf. He was talking about Cook's Mountain. Well, Yancey McLeod has his place up there, all right? So the marks, the distinguishing geographic marks that Lawson saw, you can go right up on that overlook and see them today. That particular night, Lawson, they're at camp there, and he said, let me see if I can say it right. He said, he heard the most dismalest noise that ever pierced his ears. And he asked the Indian guide what that was. And the Indian guide said that was the lions and the tigers and the animals coming out of the swamp to hunt deer. And what he was talking about, we had mountain lions, of course, and we had bobcats, and we had wolves and things. So he was hearing these animals crying in the middle of the night, and he made this comment. And this is what got me started on Lawson. When I got hold of this book a few years ago when I was 29, I read this passage in there, and I said, "Gee, I got to know where that is. I want to know where he heard all this commotion, but the native animals of Carolina we don't have anymore." And this is where it was. This is up on the overlook at Poinsett State Park. You can go up there today and see exactly what Lawson saw there. From that, it started up. They entered. Of course, they were in what is now Sumter County. This is a modern map of Sumter County. There was 4 nights, one at Tavern Creek, 2. They spent 2 nights on the overlook. At the overlook because it was a Sunday and raining. They didn't go. They came the next night to a place up at Haygood. You know where Haygood is up there? and spent the night there. We had a hard time finding this, but once we did find out where it was exactly what he said. You know, it's just, sometimes it's amazing what you can find by being on the ground and not just read something out of a book. They spent a night there, so we're 4 nights all together in Sumter County, and then the next day at noon they crossed over into what is now Kershaw County, right at Swift Creek. So the road, the Catawba Path crossed right here, right before Swift Creek goes into the swamp. The Colonial Road crossed there. The Native Road and the Colonial Road crossed right there. Later, the Colonial Road was moved up the hill to become 261, but early on it crossed right there. And this is where Lawson found the Congaree Indian people. And this is the site right here. It's on the prison farm. It's on the South Carolina prison farm property. We've never been able to excavate it. We did a little bit last year, but it's an Indian town that probably was used for occupation over a long period of time, and we've never excavated, so it's one of the prizes we're left to do here. Lawson talked about the savannas right next to it. Yeah, it is right there. It's still there. He talked about the women, how pretty they were, the Congaree women, how pretty they were in town there. And the next little clue we found was the 1734 survey for the interior town of Fredericksburg. If you know, the South Carolina legislature passed a law and took it upon themselves to grant, to lay out and thus grant homesteads to people that would settle in the interior. And the primary reason being so they would protect Charleston from the native depredations, all right? So they were going to use these people for fodder, you know, to shoot it out at the Indians and not bother Charleston. Well, the first one they settled was Fredericksburg. We still have the original of this thing in History and Archives. It's one of the few we still have. And it's still readable, although it's fading. But this is a copy of it that St. Julian made of a survey. And the survey actually took in a very large area here. It goes all the way from below Swift Creek up to Sanders Creek. And the town of Camden is now right here. This is Camden. But originally it was going to be down in Fredericksburg. It's actually centered on Pine Tree Creek, which is Mulberry Plantation now. All right. So very fortunately, St. Julian, although his map really is terrible, as inaccurate as it can be, and obviously he didn't do much. It does show the Catawba Path on that, so it was easy enough to pick up the Catawba Path off of the 1734 plat. Here's Blanding's map, Smithsonian map, which shows I put the Catawba Path on it. Shows the Indian town. It shows the mounds there on the river south of Camden. It shows the city of Camden. This is the Catawba Path that passes through the middle of Mulberry Plantation, right south of Camden. It's just an old farm road now. But you realize that road's been there probably 1,000 years, right? Here's the early land grants in the area, which also we used to pick out where the path was. Because the path shows on many of the land grants. So we picked out the path from the land grants. The path goes through the middle. Broad Street in Camden is the Catawba Path, all right? The road right straight up through the middle of Camden, that's the Catawba Path. Lawson went up through this about one morning, about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. He passed through the town of Camden. Probably stopped at Hardee's for lamb. All right, north of Camden, Lawson spent the next night on Gum Swamp, which I noticed is a real neat picture somewhere on the wall that I've never seen before. He spent that next night on Gum Swamp, and the next day they got up early and started walking, and at noon on Friday, January the 17th, 1701, Lawson ate lunch on that rock right there. It actually went it goes all the way under the road. There you see the rock outcrop right here. This is on the what is the road called? Hanging Rock Road.
Flat Rock Road.
Flat Rock Road, I'm sorry, you're right. Flat Rock Road. So they ate lunch here, and that night they went on to Hanging Rock Creek. This is the Catawba Path goes straight up through Camden, and then above Camden it turns off, 5 miles above town, 4 or 5 miles, it turns off on a little country road called Flat Rock Road. And it winds on up there through the hills there and comes out in Heath Springs. And do it so this is the road right here. This is one of the landmarks we picked out that Lawson talked about on the way. Lawson spent the next night in Hanging Rock Creek, where we had the Battle of the Revolution. Now, one of the neat things about this is we found out there's two things that put us on the trail here. One is a 1752 plat to a man named McGee, land grant to a man named McGee, which showed the Catawba Path on it, so that clicked us in. And then 2 years ago, we found an unpublished manuscript in the University of Virginia from a man who had come down the Catawba Path from Petersburg, Virginia in 1698, 3 years before Lawson did. And he wrote about it, and he spent the night right here. He called it High Rocks Campground, or High Rocks Camp. He named everything. Some local, something caught his attention, he would name it. And this man spent the night right here. So we have very good documentation of this place here. This is one of the fortunate things we picked up on with Lawson. This was an unpublished manuscript that belonged to Paul Mellon. He had collected these things for years and years, and he had them in his library. He didn't know what he had. When he died, they became public. You know, he gave them to the University of Virginia, and we found it, and it collaborates. In a manner of speaking, it collaborates Lawson. It never mentions Lawson, but we've tied the two of them together now, so that's part of the story we're working on. Lawson went on up through the east central part of Lancaster County, east of the town of Lancaster. It's called, most of it's called Potter Road, named for the Yankee general that came down through here wreaking so much havoc. A little bit later on, and he noted these little wet places which we found right on top of the watershed, all in southern Lancaster County. This map is called a Cook's map. It's one of the earliest maps that shows a good shot of the upcountry. It's earlier than Luzon, actually. A British officer named William Churton collected most of the data for the Cook's map, and it's the one map that shows the Catawba Path as it goes up through here. Now, this is also the Colonial Road. Remember, this is the road from Camden to Charlotte. And along that road, you had the Battle of Hobkirk Hill, the Battle of Camden, the Battle of Rugley's Mill, another skirmish I can't think of the name of, right above that flat rock. So you had,
Yeah, there was a battle at Flat Rock,
Yeah.
Beaver Creek.
Okay, all right.
Just above there.
This road has been there a long time. It's famous, you know, all through our early history also. Same route. Anyhow, this map shows this road. It shows how the boundary between North and South Carolina really was basically the road, the center line of the road, right, initially. It's changed now. Here's the Catawba Indian Reservation here. It was laid out later on. But this is the original road Lawson traveled on. George, how am I doing on time?
I think about 3 minutes.
Oh, good. All right, anyhow. Here's the route on a modern day topo map where you met the Water Indians and 3 different Waxhaw towns as they moved in. Here's what these towns look somewhat like. Lawson would spend the night in what he called the townhouse, the big house there. This is all in Lancaster County, South Carolina. Here's the map in Pineville, North Carolina. It talks about the Catawba Path. They've done a much better job up there of locating this route than we have in South Carolina, but they only knew parts of it. Now we finished our story as far as locating the Catawba Path, and now we're working on the rest of Lawson's stuff, if you will, about who the people were with him, you know, what happened to him after that, who his children were, and all that sort of thing. We hope to have this story published a few
He had the answer. He was not going to sign a paper to be loyal to the king. He was going to fight for British. When he got back to Williamsburg County, the word spread through the county, and several officers rose up. They were either militia or had been in the regular army. Captain Henry Mouzon organized a crew. William McCottry, with the famed McCottry rifles, organized a crew. William Macaulay and John James of the Lake organized their militia groups and reported in. They had 300 souls armed, ready to fight. At this time, also, word was taken to General Gates by a committee of Major John James, Captain Henry Mouzon, Lieutenant Joseph Scott, requesting a leader for their Williamsburg Brigade. And they specifically asked for this hopping Colonel, Francis Marion. Now, since Gates wasn't happy with this little bunch of South Carolinians that joined his army, he agreed, and Francis Marion accepted. Some stories say that Governor Rutledge was also there and commissioned him to go back into South Carolina. Some stories omit that. But anyhow, Francis Marion accepted this responsibility, and he left the army before the Battle of Camden. And William James, we all know William W. James, right? This is his description of Francis Marion when he joined the army that joined, been collected for him in Williamsburg County. On the 10th or 12th of August, General Marion, he wasn't quite a general yet, but later he was. General Marion arrived at the post at Lynch's Creek, commissioned by Governor Rutledge to take the command of the party there, and a large extent of the country on the east side of Santee. He was a stranger to the officers and men, and they flocked about him to obtain a sight of their future commander. He was rather below the middle stature of men, which would say he's height challenged. And they lean and swarthy. His body was well set, but his knees and ankles were badly formed, and he still limped upon one leg. He had a countenance remarkably steady. Remember all this description, because I'm going to show you what Francis Marion looked like before I leave you today. Don't fall. He had a countenance remarkably steady. His nose was aquiline, his chin projecting, his forehead was large and high, and his eyes black and piercing. He was now 48 years of age, but still, even at this age, his frame was capable of enduring fatigue and every privation necessary for a partisan. His wisdom and patriotism will become henceforth conspicuous. Of a character so much venerated, even trifles became important. He was dressed in a close, round-bodied crimson jacket of a coarse texture and wore a leather cap, part of the uniform of the 2nd Regiment, with a silver crescent in front, inscribed with the words "Liberty or Death." He was accompanied by his friend Colonel Peter Horry and some other officers. Next, what happened was the second calamity in South Carolina, Battle of Camden, 16 August. The second Continental Army that Congress sent was annihilated. And the famous part of that story is Horatio Gates made it from Camden to Hillsborough in record time. Nobody's beat his record since.
Yeah.
But the army was totally annihilated. Tall was killed. The Continental part of the army held as long as they could, but the militia ran off, as they sometimes did. The next stupid thing that the British did was send Major James Weems of the 63rd Regiment, plus a band of regular Tories, a total of about 600 men, down into the Santee to punish them. Major Weems was ordered by Cornwallis to punish the Whigs along the PD. On the 20th of August, he crossed the Black River at Benbow's Ferry and began his scorched earth campaign. Y'all know about Major Weems? No. I'm glad I'm here. On the 27th of August in Kingstree, he met by a force of John James's little army. They had a skirmish. I don't think anybody won that one. He proceeded eastward to burn Indiantown Presbyterian Church, which he called a sedition shop, because the Anglicans, the Anglican Church were the good guys, and the Presbyterians, being Scotch-Irish, were the bad guys. So they burnt that church, and he went on to Georgetown. Now, in the week or so that he was active scorching the earth, he burned 50 plantations. He killed 30 men. He hung an almost innocent gentleman by the name of Adam Cusack. He destroyed the crops, he killed the livestock, and he left a path of devastation 15 miles wide from King Street to Sharon. Now, Williams was captured at the Battle of Fish Dam Ford in November of 1780, and on his person he had this list of 50 plantations. This campaign of destruction by Major Williams made him the second most hated British man in South Carolina, the first being Tarleton. But he became Francis Marion's best recruiting officer. Because all these families that had been had their homes destroyed, they knew which side they were going to be on, and these were the guys who rallied to these patriot bands. Because after the Battle of Camden, there was no Continental Army, there was no Congressional Army, there was nobody in South Carolina to confront the British but Francis Marion here in the Low Country. Back to Francis Marion's flashback. 24 August. Francis Marion was at Nelson's Ferry and learned from captured prisoners that they had taken, that the British were sending prisoners they had captured at Camden back to Charleston. And the British stopped for the night at Sumter's house on the Great Savannah. With Major Hugh Horry and the Williamsburg men, they attacked that house at night. They caught the guard with their muskets stacked. They released 150 men of the Maryland Continental Line that were the prisoners taken to Camden, but all of them didn't want to be free. According to this story, most of them headed home, about half of them, but 85 decided to march on to Charleston as prisoners of war. I guess they thought since Charleston had surrendered, the whole world was at an end, even up in Maryland. On the 26th of June, Francis Marion crossed Lynch's Creek at Witherspoon's Ferry. He wrote a letter to Peter Ory telling of Gates' loss at Camden the first time that Peter Ory would have known this, and instructed Ory to join him at Britain's Neck. On the 29th of August, Francis Marion wrote his report of his activities and sent it with a Lieutenant Keating Simons to the head of the Army at Hillsborough, North Carolina. On the 9th day of September, Gates reported to Congress and included a little blurb mentioning Francis Marion's release of these prisoners. Extracts of Gates' report was released to the press. He knew those days. So our hero, Francis Marion, was introduced to the public. However, they spelled his name M-A-R-I-E-N, as was wont to happen. So in my mind, this began Francis Marion's 13 months of guerrilla warfare as a swamp dog. And I'm going to show you a few slides. For those of you who may not know, this is Boris' 2nd South Carolina Regiment recreated. Funny little leather caps. I thought Puckett would have been in there, but I don't see Puckett.
He'd be easy to spot.
Yeah. Here we are. Again, I don't see Puckett behind here people. One of the little hats with the silver crescents. One reenactment we did at Williamsburg, and at that moment in time, I was the commander of the 2nd Regiment, and we were brigaded with lots of other Continental reenactment units with their 3-corner hat. And we stuck to the manual, the British manual of 1764. And the rest of the guys used von Steuben's improved manual. So, and we had our funny little hats and everybody else. So we had a big formation, and the guy the colonel out in front gave the order, the order arms, and the guys went boom, boom. We went boom, 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 boom. And several other commands that 1764 manual had a lot more movements than von Steuben. So after that display, people came into our camp and they wanted to know why we were different. So it was a great public relations feature. The colonel for that formation was a guy from Virginia, and he told us to do it just like we did the last time. Well, I wasn't there the last time. So he wanted us all to do the Von Steuben drill movements. But it turned out to be a spectacularly wonderful thing for the Second Regiment actually. Now, here's a historical marker that tells Francis Marion was actually born. He was a real person, not a figment of our imagination, and a hero magnified by Parson Weems. This is where he's buried, on Belle Isle Plantation, ground where he went after he hurt his ankle. His brother's plantation, Belle Isle on the Santee River, now somewhat underwater. Now, I'm going to show you what Francis Marion really looks like. There he is. Does that agree with what you thought? Did you know that existed?
No, where is it?
I'm not going to tell you. You'll want to go. It's a bust that was a lady did, and it's in the library in Georgetown, South Carolina, and then historic.
But where did
In
she?
my mind, that's what I think Francis Marion looked like. And some of the more recent paintings of his glorious on his horse and in the gold uniform of the general, that's not the Francis Marion in my mind. This is my Francis Marion. And I'm through.
Doug, that bust, that's modern though, isn't it?
Ma'am?
The bust is modern, is it not?
It's clay, yes. It's
It's modern, it's done recently.
She's saying modern.
It's done
Modern.
Modern. Where are you from, child?
You know where I'm from.
I've got a hickey in my papers that was a newspaper announcement of that was done about 25 years ago.
But the person who did it never saw the general.
No. Oh, is that what you're trying to? Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, according to this newspaper article, the lady who did that, modeled it after one of those paintings of Francis Marion that's on the wall. But I think her rendition was better than what she was copying. You want me to leave that up there?
Reproduce them without handling the old books. And we're a private nonprofit, so what are our
It's been good weather. A little windy, but
So it might look something more like that. You just tell me, and I'll copy it down.
That kind of reading a pretty good history.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I was
And you're just...
Al and I, we call them and talk to them when we get down in the dumps and they get us fired up again. The world famous author, TV, video star, and we got a new act that we try out on you guys today. We tried it a couple weeks ago at the Manning Rotary Club and got rave reviews. It started out as challenge the doctor, and it ended up when she turned it back to me to stump the dummy. So without further ado, the world famous author, Dr. Christine Swager. And if you hadn't noticed, that's her chauffeur back there in the back. Her manager, Dr. Bob Swager.
If you look at your schedule, you'll see that the congressman is supposed to be in this slot, but he's running late. And so I'm going to start. And if he should come, I will stop and pick up after his remarks. I started my career as a first grade teacher, and having been a first grade teacher, I can handle about anything. I want to talk to you today about what you're going to see on the bus tour and what happened at these spots. So if you'll get out your map with the numbers on it, I'll talk about particular events and tell you the number of the bus stop. Unfortunately, we can't take the bus tour and visit these sites in chronological order. But I'm going to do this in chronological order, and I'll tell you what numbers that they refer to. Now, you've heard a lot today about what happened at the Battle of Camden. And we're focusing this week on the 225th anniversary, what happened in 1780. And not an awful lot happened in Clarendon County before the Battle of Camden. So we're going to focus on what happened in the last part of that year. Now, I am not an historian. I am a storyteller. And I got into this business because I taught teachers at the university. And they said, do you know, when we teach the American Revolution, we assign as outside reading Johnny Tremaine and My Brother Sam is Dead. And they're great books. But that's the way the war was fought in Philadelphia. That's not the way the war was fought here. And they said, somebody needs to write for our students. Now, my colleagues who were historians write for other historians. And they don't write for teachers. And so they kept saying, well, Chris, you do it, and we'll help you, and we'll make sure that you don't do anything stupid. So I have a lot of friends who are serious historians, and they keep me straight. But I want to tell you some of the stories. Some have been mentioned before, and some have not. But these are the sites that we are going to see. And the first one that we're going to see is the area just this side of Nelson's Ferry and Sumter's Home, the Great Savannah, and the Battle of Great Savannah. Now, you already know that in the Revolutionary War period, the British had a port at Charleston. They had a headquarters at Camden. And to get their supplies from Charleston to Camden, they came up, usually through Monk's Corner, to Nelson's Ferry. And I can never read those things. Roughly into here, I believe. And crossed the river at Nelson's Ferry. And from there to Camden, the road pretty much followed the Catawba Trail and followed the river system up to Camden. And much of that is right through Clarendon County. After the Battle of Camden, and Marion heard about the prisoners that were being taken to Charleston to put aboard ship, because Cornwallis was concerned about smallpox. And that's why he was getting the prisoners out of Camden. Moved them down. Now, there's some conflict about how many people he had riding with him. Pat O'Kelly says over 100. The British account says that Marion had over 100. Rankin says he had about 52. He attacked at night, and George has already determined that all of Marion's night attacks happened when there was no moon. I thought that was interesting. I don't know how well he arranged that, but it seems to. Well, he attacked in the middle of the night, and he attacked on 3 sides. And he almost always attacked on 3 sides. He very rarely surrounded his enemy. And his account is that if you surround your enemy, they will fight to the death. And it would increase the danger to his own men. And one thing that we know, well, from James and also from Lighthorse Harry Lee, Francis Marion did not like to take casualties. The only bloodshed he wanted was the enemy's. He was very protective of the men who rode with him. So they attacked on 3 sides. They got to the stacked weapons, and the soldiers who were accompanying the prisoners were regular British soldiers of the 64th Regiment of Foot. After this happened, Cornwallis was embarrassed. I mean, these regiment, this 64th, serious soldiers. And this group from the Swamp had taken back the prisoners. Marion moved off, and we have some battles that are outside of Clarendon County. One of them, of course, is the Blue Savannah, where he took on Barfield and tore up the Tories pretty well. And Cornwallis had to do something about it. That's when he sent Weymouth into the area from the Santee to Georgetown. And Marion just merely disappeared into the swamps of North Carolina. And then when he came back, he was again threatening the road from Nelson's Ferry to Camden. The second big battle of interest here is the battle at Tiercote Swamp, or Tarcote Swamp, and it's number 9 on your itinerary. Now, this is a very interesting group because they sent them out from Camden. Tynes recruited militia, Tory militia, from the high hills of the Santee. And the high hills are actually on the Wateree River, not the Santee River. These were locals. They should have known the territory. They went to Camden, and they were being supplied and more or less trained in Camden. Now, the accounts suggest that the men in Camden, the citizens, locked up their women folk because this bunch was a rough bunch. They strutted around Camden, and they were threatening that they were going into the swamp and they were going to catch Marion. Well, now, of course, Marion had a tremendous spy network. And he heard about this, of course. He tracked them into Tarcote Swamp. And Tynes had camped there for the night, and he had a reasonable amount of security. So Marion again waited until very late at night, and these Tory militia were drinking and carousing and gambling, and Marion attacked. Again, he attacked on 3 sides. Killed 6 of the loyalists, wounded 14, 23 were made prisoner, and the rest of them fled into the swamp. Now, one of the card players who was killed, holding his last hand, was the ace, the jack, and the deuce of clubs. I suggest if you ever draw that hand that you drag out your musket and look over your shoulder. It's supposed to be unlucky. But Marion's men took 80 horses along with the saddles, the blankets, 80 muskets, and all of the heavy baggage. Now, one thing that has been mentioned before, Marion had no depot, he had no armory, he had to resupply and rearm his men from the ammunition that he took from dead and wounded and British prisoners. When he started out, many of his men only had a sword made from a plantation saw. And I wonder if it still had a serrated edge. If it did, wouldn't have that been a tremendous weapon? Tarcote Swamp is number 9 on your itinerary. Now, at this point, the road from Charleston or from Nelson's Ferry to Camden is under Marion's control. Now, he held no territory. He didn't have a headquarters, really. He attacked when and where he wanted, and then he moved back into the swamp. Now, this was a serious problem to Cornwallis. By now, Cornwallis has moved to Charlotte. Then Kings Mountain happened. His western flank is now exposed to all those mountain men. He moves back to Winnsboro. And Colonel Trumbull, who is at Camden, sends word to Cornwallis he needs help. He needs to clear Marion out of that road. And so Cornwallis sends Tarleton. And Tarleton comes down to the Richardson Plantation, and the Richardson Plantation, okay, I have here number 3 and 4, but I wasn't sure what I lost in place. Now Tarleton dug in, positioned his men for an ambush because he expected Marion to come out of the swamp after him. Mrs. Richardson had on the plantation a son who was in hiding, and it evidently was that son that she sent out into the swamp to warn Marion. Marion was on his way to attack. Marion camps then at Richburg Mill that evening, and he spends the night there. Charlton spends the night at the Richardson home. During the night, a prisoner escaped from Marion, got to Tarleton, and now Tarleton knows that Francis Marion will not attack because he knows of the ambush. The Richardson plantation 3 and 4, and we now go into the swamp. The numbers here will be stop 6 and 7. Now, Marion led Tarleton in a 35-mile chase to the head of Jack Swamp, around the Pocatagio River, back to Black River, and he finally sent men ahead at Bedloe's Ferry, and he prepared an ambush for Tarleton. That ambush consisted of trees along the side, so once Tarleton's men got in that area, they were sort of caught like pigs in the pen. And that was the intention. And you know, the whole Revolutionary War has a number of what-ifs. You know, what if Tarleton had continued to Benbo's Ferry? But about 26 miles into this chase, he decided that he had had enough. His men were muddy and tired. His horses were mired from going through the area. And he looked at that trackless swamp ahead, and he decided to stop the chase. It is reported that he said, "Come, my boys, let us go back, and we will find the gamecock. But as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." From that, we get the swamp fox. Now, I'm not sure that in his lifetime, Marion was known as the swamp fox. That may have come from Symp's work later on. But it wouldn't have been a bad title. We've also already heard about him being the hobby colonel. Other people referred to him as the gimpy little colonel. The men of the 2nd Regiment that he commanded referred to him as the hook-nosed bastard. And an officer, and this is quoted in Mike Coper's material there, an ugly, cross, knock-kneed, hook-nosed son of a bitch. So if you consider all of that, the swamp fox was probably a much better appellation. Tarleton returned to Richardson's. He forced the Richardson family to dig up the body of General Richardson, who had been buried 6 weeks before. He is said to have thought that they had buried the silver in the grave, but he said that he just wanted to look on the face of a brave man. Do you believe that? Anyway, Tarleton returned to Camden, and between Richardson's and Camden, he burned 30 plantation homes. Now, many of these plantation homes belonged to Loyalists, but he had the utmost contempt for any American and for all the colonists, and so he burned them. He left Camden, went back to Winnsboro, and was never in this part of the country again. Now, you know, he then goes to the western part of South Carolina and will eventually get his comeuppance at Cowpens, but that's next year. We now have another attempt to clear Marion off the road. And we have reinforcements coming up from Charleston to Camden. They're on their way to Cornwallis, and they're Fusiliers from the 7th Regiment of Foot. Even the British said that they were an unlikely, sorry bunch. But anyway, McElrath picks them up at Nelson's Ferry, and he's going to escort them up to Camden. Part of the escort, 64th Regiment of Foot, and again, regular Army, British Army soldiers. Marion, with about 300 men, starts to pursue him and catches up with him at Halfway Small. George, what number are we at? Okay, we're going to be at 5. I'm glad somebody's keeping count here. I have it here someplace. And Marion kills the pickets, shoots the pickets, and confronts Makarov. The 64th had dealt with Marion before, so they get into a field and behind a fence, and they herd in these inept Fusiliers to protect them. But the strangest thing happened. You know, if you try to write this as fiction, nobody would believe it. Makarov sends out an officer to Francis Marion and complains that Marion doesn't fight fair. Because, I mean, after all, Marion just got the pickets. Now, Marion counters with the fact that, after all, the British are burning houses and turning women and children out, and they didn't think much of that argument. But for some reason, they decide on what can only be described as a duel. Each group will take 20 men, and they'll meet on the field of battle. Well, the British have their 20 men, and Marion selects his. Major, is it Vander? Horst, is going to command, and some of Marion's men have rifles. The British have muskets. Those muskets are only good at about 50 yards, and then they're not terribly accurate. So the major says to the group, well, at what distance should we fire? And someone of Marion's officers said, well, 50 yards. And the major said, well, I'm not really very good at distances, so if you tap me on the shoulder when we get to 50 yards, I'll give the order to fire. They start in across, and within 100 yards, the British shoulder their weapons and move off the field. Well, it's late in the day, I guess, and Marion is perplexed, but everybody settles down for the night. And the British campfires are going, and there's a lot of noise. Quiets down about midnight. When Marion wakes up the next morning, he discovers that the British have left. Now, they've left their wagons and their heavy equipment because that would be noisy. And, but they've left. And Marion, of course, is very upset. And he sends part of his partisans after them. They decide, as they get up the road, that in order to move faster, James and some of the men with the best horses will go around the British and get to Singleton's mill and take Singleton's house, which is on a rise, and from there they can delay the British advance until Marion catches up with them. And when the British arrive at Singleton's, that's exactly what has happened. James is in the house, and they fire one volley, and then the Patriots take to their horses and disappear. The British are confused until they get to Singleton's house and find out Singleton's family has smallpox. Now, the partisans weren't afraid of much, but they certainly were afraid of smallpox. Now, at this point, Marion controls the road between Nelson's Ferry and Camden. Colonel Balfour in Charleston orders the road really closed. He orders the British to go to Camden by way of the south side of the the Santee River, and up and across the Congaree. But then that puts them on the wrong side of the Wateree for Camden, so they've got to ferry back across. And he also stops the river traffic because Marion is taking boats on the Santee River. One merchant from Camden doesn't get the word. He sends a flatboat down the river. Marion takes it at Nelson's Ferry, unloads it, and burns it. Now, we have the British have a problem, obviously. The road on the other side will work, but it is not convenient. General Leslie has arrived in Charleston. He is to move up and join Lord Cornwallis at Winnsboro, and he brings with him a very capable officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel John Watson Tadwell Watson. And they leave him in the area, and his job is to clear the road on this side of the river and take it back from Francis Marion. Up until now, most of the protection from the road had been at Nelson's Ferry on the other side. There'd been Hessians there. And of course, that was the high side of the river. On this side, which was all swamp down there, the landing for Nelson's Ferry was very, very close to Waibu Swamp, and Francis Marion owned that swamp too. So Watson realizes that in order to take back this road, he's got to have a stronghold on this side of the river. And so, coming up the road, he selects an Indian mound on the Santee or on the Scotts Lake area, and builds a stockade on top of it, and posts roughly 125 soldiers there, most of them from the 64th Regiment of Foot. Again, British regulars. And his job is to take back the swamp. He finishes that post the end of December of 1780, and because he is a very humble man, he names it after himself, and it is Fort Watson. Now, we now come to the end of 1780. Nathaniel Greene has just taken over command of the Continental Army. He sent Light Horse Harry Lee down to Snow's Island to campaign with Francis Marion. He sent Morgan out to the west, and he'll, of course, meet Charlton at Cowpens. But if you want to know how all of this ends, you're going to have to come back next year, because we will then talk about what happened in the Southern Campaign and with Francis Marion in the year 1781. Now, did we end at the same time? Any questions?
This is just a slide that we put together a couple years ago because we found out that people don't have an appreciation for how much of the war was fought in the South and in South Carolina in particular. And I don't know if you can read these numbers down on the bottom, but the blue is from 1775 to 1779. The red is the rest of the war, and the green are the battles that Marion fought in. And this is taken from Henry Lumpkin's 1981 book. So if you go in some of the current books, you'll find the increased numbers, but the interesting thing is the ratio stays about the same. And what that says is, in blue is 51 battles, in red is 66, and of those 66, you got Marion in 22 of them. So a third of the battles that were fought in South Carolina in the from 1780 on, Marion's guys were in. So who carried the battle? It doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to figure that out. You know, I mean, here's a guy that is winning. This is the area that he roamed in. Chris has already thoroughly covered that.
Don't you love this military jargon? You can expect that from Colonel Summers. The choke points.
What Chris taught us, and she neglected to say today, was that the British textbook she learned history from said that the British say they lost the war in the South So why aren't we as Americans then saying we won the war in the South? You know, how incredibly dull.
Do you not know why?
Why?
Because the next war we lost and the guys that wrote the history books lived up north.
Exactly.
Amen.
Where did when was Cornwallis a dead man and he didn't know it? When he marched past Marion and he got up here and he could not secure his supply lines. And Chris has covered that. Other people have talked about it, that his supplies were coming out of Charleston and out of Georgetown. Look how close that is. You know, that for guys with the horses and the skill that Marion's guys had, that's not very far to switch from one line to the other. And, you know, all of this, you know, not take anything away from any of the other battles because they're all important. And as Chris said, they all fall together. But when you leave somebody cut your supply line, you just, you know, giving them the whole hand to play.
Could
yes,
I
sir.
make a, oh.
Just to keep in mind, in 1781, after Morgan wins at Cowpens in January, Cornwallis is going to actually cut his supply lines and go in hot pursuit of Greene's entire army, including Morgan's part of it, all the way to the Dan River in Virginia. The next time Cornwallis has an actual supply line, other than looting the countryside, is when he retreats to Wilmington, North Carolina, notably outside of Marion's operating area, and picks up supplies from the British fleet after Guilford Courthouse, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse.
May I make a point here on that map? Savage's book on the Santee River points out that things are very different today than during the Revolutionary War period. If you think of all of the dams and the lakes that are behind the Santee now, all of those up on the Catawba, the Wateree River, the Broad River, the Saluda River, the Reedy River, the Pacolet, all of those dams are holding back water, which in the Revolutionary times came down through here. And each spring, on a wet season, the Wateree and the Congaree, which form the Santee, would go over their banks 10 miles. So these swamp systems, and you'll see some swamps today in the class, were far more extensive then than they are now. And Marion had a lot more room to hide than he would today. Okay, George, where are we going here?
I think you may have a sheet in your folder that shows this. I don't know, about 6 or 8 references I went through and pieced this together, so I don't claim it's complete, but it's pretty good. The red is the British victories. The blue is the Patriot, or the rebel victories from January through July of 1780. That's pretty convincingly the British. From August to December, you notice the change. Very little red here and a lot of blue. And I think the next slide, no. When you put it together, add those all up. Wasn't that far separated for the year. Now, you know, that doesn't tell the whole story because one victory at Charleston is just one here, but you know, what a tremendous loss for the Patriots or for the Americans. But that counts as one here. But look at the skirmish battle, whatever difference there. And this is what the leaders were doing. These are the guys that you hear about all the time as the guys out there fighting the battles. And, you know, our boy Sumter is not, he's causing a lot of havoc. But if you count the scores, the same Tarleton gets a lot of publicity. Marion, you know, doesn't get as much publicity nationally, but a lot of times the worker bees don't get the word. It's the guys that do the yelling the loudest get the word.
Because I was hurrying, I didn't mention the Great Savannah. Of course, the British were camped at one of Thomas Sumter's homes. He had 2 homes, and they were quite nice on this side of the river. But he had started out as a storekeeper on the other side of the river, south of Nelson's Ferry. He was illiterate at that point. He didn't even know how to spell his own name. But by the time he moved over here and the Revolutionary War started, he was very prosperous. And I like to mention to people that his story demonstrates what you can do with a lot of hard work if you marry a very wealthy woman. He married into the Canty family, and the Canty family owned tremendous amounts of territory on this side of the river. Now, are you going to play the Swamp Fox song?
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Francis Marion. I fought the British Redcoats in '76.
I'm sorry, that's as loud as it'll play. So turn up your hearing aids. And the music, the song is in your folder there. Anyway, take a break, and we'll either get together in about 20 minutes to get on the bus, or we'll get together to listen to Representative Clyburn if he comes.
Get ready for this. Somebody said we think we might get the congressman to come. And of course the question was, who's going to introduce him? And somebody said to my wife, Chris, whom you just heard from, well, you do it. Chris said, gee, I'm introducing Governor Rutledge on the same day. Now, Congressman, don't be scared. Governor Rutledge is not coming back to life. So it fell to me, and I have shared the lectern with the good congressman, I guess, about 3 years ago for Memorial Day over at Santee. We beat the drums and raised a little money occasionally with Bill Clark over at Santee Cooper Resort. When I headed the Santee Development Association, I used to write little love letters. You know what those are. Congressman, we need, we want, give us. You understand those. And more recently, since I've enjoyed my 2 braces and my cane, I've been writing about Veterans Affairs with some regularity. So we've been corresponding back and forth for well over a decade now. I was supposed to have by email something that your office sent out. I'm so old now that I don't understand this, but you know, emails don't always make it. I've heard about cyberspace, and I kind of expect someday I'll walk out of the house and I'll be crushed by a bunch of this stuff coming out of cyberspace. I don't know how it stays out there, but it does. We don't have much time, so it's a good thing I didn't get it. I think most folks here from South Carolina know you, but we have guests from a good number of states here today. That's very important. So let me just say a word. After college, he did something which is kind of near and dear to the hearts of most folks here. He taught, but he taught history, which is a pretty good subject for our group here. And of course, I think you know that over the years he has been extremely active in the preservation of cultural and historical affairs, and that's very important for this group here. His interests have gone far wider than that, though. We are delighted to have with us today the representative of the 6th Congressional District of this great state of South Carolina, Representative James D. Clyburn.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you very, very much, and thank you, Bob, for, I hope, presenting me to most of these people. If I have to be introduced to the 6th Congressional District after 12 years in the Congress, I'm in serious trouble. But my wife's with me today, many of you know that. So good to see all of you here, especially my longtime friend Joe Stooks. I asked Joe when I came to the door, was he going to do Francis Marion today? And he tells me, he's going to do Rutledge. And I love history, and I spent the first 10 years of my professional life in Charleston. And so I have a great deal of knowledge and respect for Rutledge. But I really, really do hope that history is not going to repeat itself this evening. And I think all of you understand my drift on that. I'm particularly interested in what you're doing. John Spratt and I had some discussions some weeks and months ago. John, as you know, is an expert on our nation's budget. And there are times when our interests conflict, because John is looking for ways to make sure that this budget stays in balance. As you know, since the last 5 years, he has been failing in that effort. And of course, I'm always looking for ways to get some uplifting and retrofitting and some investments made in our efforts. And so consequently, a lot of times we sit down and try to see how we can balance out our interests. And one of the things I went to him with some time ago, sometimes after I introduced the legislation that created the South Carolina National Heritage Corridor. Now, the way we do things in Washington, a lot of times, someone said to me one time, that there's no way in the record that that's your legislation. Well, it may not be. But the fact of the matter, we introduced the legislation, I guess some 10 years ago. And at the time of its introduction, of course, we were moving into a way that they use in Washington to camouflage things. And of course, we were about to do an omnibus bill. And so the South Carolina Heritage Corridor became law as an attachment to that omnibus bill that year. But trust me, the legislation was introduced as a separate piece of legislation by yours truly, and it's now law. And it's sort of been funded to the tune of about $1 million a year ever since. Those monies go, of course, to Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. They manage that corridor. But that corridor, the incentive of which came from, and though I received a letter one time from a good friend of mine, who's now on call, saying, I don't see anything in this bill that mentions anything about the old Hamburg Railroad. Well, the legislation does not say that specifically. But what we use in our arguments is the fact that the best friend ran on the old Hamburg Railroad, and that this was a natural for the corridor. The corridor enters South Carolina up around Walhalla, and it continues all the way down.
Is your bus driving abilities here? That's dirt roads.
That's up there, back in, pull out to help you back in there.
Where we turned into the
I
refuge.
don't know whatever happened to that thing.
See, that's what Val Green talked about this morning. It's not on.
I think right into here. And in fact, I think we came across Nelson Ferry here, and there was an Indian town just south of Wambaugh Creek down here. And then there was another Indian town, I believe they said it was a long lead, which would be about 3 miles right north of here, and I believe that was right up about I-95 and on the mound up there. So I think this was the place where Petitecchio was. About 4 months ago at the Houston Archives Department, I found 1758 plat or land grant. And you got to realize that this lake out here now covers up not only high, dry land and swamp and fields and stuff, but also there were other bodies of water out here beside just the river itself. There were a lot of old river beds and old lakes, oxbow lakes and things. And And on this land grant I found the other day, which is just south of Wambach Creek down here, about, maybe 2 miles from here, I found a lake showing on there, Oxbow Lake showing there, which was called Lake Cados, C-A-D-O-S. It's now called a Kudo unit of this wildlife refuge. It's just the next unit down here. So they changed the word a little bit, but I'm sure it came from the same word. Well, I looked up in the dictionary what Cados means, and it's an old Jewish word for holy place. So the only way that name would have gotten here was that it was given by the Spanish, who probably came in either with De Soto or 26 years later with Pardo. And the Spanish did say that after traveling through Florida and Georgia that this seems like the best place on earth when they got to Quebec. So I reasoned that lake was probably named by the Spanish soldiers, the Jewish Spanish soldiers who came in this area with De Soto or even with Pardo.
Yeah, okay.